Hey there and welcome back. If you're getting cozy right now, maybe the lights are low, maybe you've pulled a blanket up around you, maybe there's a cup of something nearby. Good. Stay where you are. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from and what time is it for you. And if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. Tonight we are going to the loudest, most expensive, most extravagantly theatrical private party ever held in the history of the British monarchy. The party will be held on a single hot summer evening in central London. The host will be the new Prince Regent, the eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte. The cost, in the rumours that will run through the city the following morning, will be £120,000, which in modern values is somewhere in the region of £15 million. 2,000 people will be invited. 30,000 people, 3 days later, will try to force their way into the empty rooms simply to see what the party looked like. Live fish will swim through a silver canal running down the centre of a 200-foot supper table. A man in a complete suit of medieval armour will stand silently at the back of the room. The fireworks will light up the night sky over Pall Mall. The last guests will leave at 6 in the morning, and many of them will look, by then, very tired. This is the Carlton House Fête, held on the 19th of June, 1811. It is one of the most documented social events in British history. It has been written about, painted, satirised, novelised, and quoted in every account of the Regency for more than 2 centuries, and we are going, you and I, to spend the evening inside it, slowly, room by room, letting the spectacle unfold around us in real time. I will warn you, before we begin, that this is going to be a kind of evening. This is a party. This is a man in a public role at the start of his power, throwing the sort of party that announces a power and inviting most of the political and social leadership of Britain to come and see him do it. This is theatre, this is heat and music and crowd and the candles in the chandeliers and the smell of food on 500 dishes. There will be moments of great visual beauty and moments of considerable physical discomfort and moments of private absurdity, all running through the same long summer evening together. There is also, woven through it, a family drama. The Prince Regent's mother, the Queen of England, has refused to attend her son's party. She will not let her daughters come. She is, on this night, 20 miles away at Windsor, sitting beside her ill husband, while her son in central London hosts the largest private gathering in the country's history. We will return to that fact later in the evening, because it matters. For now, settle in. The carriage that is going to take us to Carlton House is, in our imagination, just turning into Pall Mall. Let us begin. Picture first the world we are about to step into. The hour is somewhere between 7 and 8 in the evening. The date is Wednesday, the 19th of June, 1811. London, on this evening, is the largest city in the world, with a population approaching 1 million people. It is also the capital of a country at war. The war has been going on, almost continuously, for nearly 20 years. The French Revolution, in 1789, set in motion the cascade of conflicts that became the Revolutionary Wars and then the Napoleonic Wars. By the summer of 1811, Napoleon Bonaparte controls most of continental Europe. His armies have crushed the Austrians, the Prussians, the Spanish, the Italians. He sits in Paris as the Emperor of the French. He has, in the previous decade, threatened to invade Britain itself. The threat of invasion has receded since the British naval victory at Trafalgar in 1805, but the war on land has not stopped. British troops are at this moment fighting under the Duke of Wellington in Spain and Portugal, in what we now call the Peninsular War. The cost of the war has been enormous. The country is in heavy debt. Inflation has eaten into the wages of working people. There's been industrial unrest in the manufacturing towns of the north. Unemployment in some trades is severe. Many people are hungry. Inside the country, separately from the war, the king is unwell. George III has had recurring episodes of mental illness for over 20 years now. The episode that began in late 1810 has not lifted. It has in fact deepened. By February of this year, 1811, Parliament has been forced to enact the Regency, the formal arrangement by which the king's eldest son acts in place of the king for as long as the king is unable to perform his constitutional functions. The Prince of Wales, who has spent 48 years waiting for a turn at the type of power his father has held, is now, finally, the effective head of state. He is 48 years old. He has been waiting a long time, and tonight is the party at which he announces, with the maximum possible visibility, that he has arrived. The party has been postponed twice. It was originally scheduled for early June. The newspapers, late in May, announced that it had to be put off because the king was unwell. The newspapers in early June announced a second postponement following a private letter from the prince's mother, Queen Charlotte, urging him to delay further out of respect for his father's continuing illness. The prince agreed to the second delay reluctantly. He did not want to delay any longer. He set the new date for the 19th of June, 2 weeks after the king's birthday, which fell on the 4th, and 3 weeks after the original scheduled date. The official reason for the party, as printed on the invitations, is twofold: to mark the king's birthday and to honour the exiled French royal family who have been living in England since the fall of the Bourbons in 1793. The actual reason for the party, as everyone in London understands, is that the Prince Regent finally has the power he has been waiting for, and he intends to celebrate it on a scale that no host in Britain has ever previously attempted. This is the world. A country at war. A king who is unwell. A new regent who has been waiting for his moment. And in the middle of London, on a hot Wednesday evening in late June, the largest private party that has ever been held on these islands, about to begin, we are arriving by carriage. The carriage is a private hackney that has been hired for the evening, and it is making its way slowly westward along the Strand toward Charing Cross. The horses' hooves on the stone sets make a ringing sound. The wheels of the carriage rumble underneath. Inside, the leather-cushioned compartment is hot. The air outside, in central London on a hot June evening, is hotter still. The day has been warm, and the city has stored the warmth in its brick and stone, and the air at street level is the close urban air that London produces in summer when there has been no rain for a few days. You are wearing your evening clothes. If you are imagining yourself as a man, you are wearing breeches of pale silk or fine wool, white silk stockings, low-buckled shoes with silver buckles, a long-tailed coat in dark blue or claret, a white waistcoat, and a high white linen cravat tied with the precise complexity that the period required. Your hair is dressed with pomade and lightly powdered. If you are imagining yourself as a woman, you are wearing a high-waisted gown in the slim Regency line, the bodice low-cut, and the skirt falling straight to your slippers, the fabric some kind of pale silk or muslin in white or ivory or pale primrose, with embroidered hems and puff sleeves. Your hair is dressed up high in the Greek style, with ribbons and perhaps a jewelled bandeau through the forehead. You are wearing long white kid gloves to the elbow. You are carrying a fan and a silk reticule with your essentials inside. You are warm. The air in the carriage is close. There is the faint smell, very faintly, of perspiration through the fabric of your clothes, and on top of that the heavier scent of the perfumes you have applied this afternoon. The eau de cologne if you are a man, the rose water and orange flower water if you are a woman, perhaps a hint of jasmine or violet or whichever, from that era's fashionable scents you favour. The carriage smells of leather and of the perfumes and of the dry dust that any London carriage carries on a summer evening. We turn into Pall Mall. Pall Mall, on this evening, is a long broad street running roughly east to west between Charing Cross and St James's, with the great houses of the aristocracy lining its length. The road is broad. The buildings on either side are 5 or 6 stories high. In the cream and yellow stone of the late Georgian London, there are oil lamps at intervals along the pavement, lit by the lamplighter who has just come through, and the lamps are throwing pools of yellow light onto the stone setts at their feet. Up ahead, several hundred yards in front of us, the road is completely jammed. The jam is a jam of carriages. There are perhaps 200 carriages standing in the road in front of us, all moving very slowly, all heading in the same direction, all bound for the same address. The carriages are of every kind that the late Georgian period produced. There are landaus with the tops folded back so that the occupants can sit in the open evening air. There are barouches, more elegant than the landaus, with the folding hood drawn up against the chance of dew. There are coaches with the closed bodies and the windows. There are postchaises and chariots and the private carriages of the great houses, each painted with the family arms on the door panels in heraldic colours. There are the more formal full-size state carriages of the most senior aristocratic households, gilded and painted and drawn by 4 matched horses with the postilions in livery. The drivers are mostly silent. The horses are restless from standing still in the heat. The carriage in front of us, a dark green chariot with a coronet on the door, has its window down, and you can see the silhouette of a lady inside fanning herself in the interior space. The carriage behind us, a yellow landau with the top down, contains 2 gentlemen in evening dress, one of whom is leaning out and complaining loudly about the slowness of the queue. There is a faint general buzz of voices from the carriages around us, a hum of irritation and anticipation in roughly equal measure. Lean forward and look out of your carriage window for a moment. Pall Mall, for the entire visible length, is solid with carriages. The lamps along the pavement are lit, throwing their pools of yellow oil lamp light onto the stones below. The pavements themselves, normally crowded at this hour with people walking home from the offices and the shops, are tonight blocked with onlookers, ordinary Londoners, who have come out to watch the great procession of the aristocracy arriving at the Prince's party. There are perhaps several hundred people standing on either pavement, in their working clothes, watching the carriages go by. They are mostly silent. They are looking at the heraldry on the carriage doors, trying to identify which families are arriving. They are looking at the dresses of the ladies through the carriage windows, taking in the fashions. They are not by any standard observed in modern accounts hostile. They are simply observers. The arrival of 2,000 aristocrats at the Prince Regent's fête is, for them, the theatrical event of the evening, watched from the pavements as one might watch a parade. The smell that drifts in through the carriage window from the street is the composite smell of a great London thoroughfare on a summer evening. The dust raised by the carriage wheels, hanging in the still air, the smell of the horses, dozens of them in the immediate vicinity, with the leather of their harness and the faint sharp note of horse sweat. The smell of the oil lamps along the pavement, with the note that lamp oil produces when burning. The smell of the open drainage in the gutter, less pleasant, noticeable when one passes the mouth of a side street. Above all of it, the general close air smell of central London on a hot day after a week without rain. Street vendor is somewhere on the pavement, calling out his wares, strawberries by the sound of it. Fresh strawberries from the market gardens of West London, sold by the punnet to whoever will buy them. The voice carries through the evening air. A few of the people on the pavement are buying. The sound of his calling and the clink of coins in his hand is one of the ordinary city sounds that, on this evening, runs underneath the more elaborate ceremonial sounds of the carriage queue. Why is the queue so slow? Because every guest, on arrival at Carlton House, has to be set down at the front of the colonnade. The carriage has to drive on. The next carriage has to come up. The set-down operation, even with practiced footmen and grooms, takes a minute or two per carriage. With 2,000 guests arriving over the course of perhaps 3 or 4 hours, the inevitable result is exactly a form of jam we are now sitting in. The newspapers will report tomorrow that Pall Mall, St. James's Street, and the Haymarket were all blocked solid with carriages by 8 o'clock in the evening. We are at the back of the queue. We will, by the end of the evening, have sat in the carriage for perhaps an hour before we reach the front of the colonnade. The guests who arrived an hour earlier than us got there in less time. The guests still arriving an hour after us will sit longer. The waiting itself is part of the experience. Sit with the heat and the perfumes and the irritated voices. Sit with the movement of the carriage, 6 feet at a time, every 2 or 3 minutes. Sit with the anticipation of what is at the end of the queue, because the city has been talking about nothing else for weeks. The Prince Regent's Fête, the party of the century, the 2,000 invitations, the decorations, the fireworks, the supper, the fountain, the fish, the gold service, the Bourbon court in exile, the dancing, the conservatory. The crowd has been turning the rumours over and over for a month. And tonight, finally, the rumours will be confirmed or contradicted by direct observation. We move forward another 6 feet. The carriage in front of us has reached the curve where the turn into the Carlton House courtyard becomes visible. The lady in the green chariot draws her head back inside the window. The 2 gentlemen in the yellow landau behind us have stopped complaining and are now looking ahead with attentive interest. The drivers tighten their reins. The horses, sensing the imminent end of the standing, lift their heads and shift their weight. The whole queue, with the slowness of any large mechanical thing finally engaging, begins to move at a less glacial pace. While we wait, I want to tell you something about the man whose party this is, because the whole evening is, in a sense, an expression of his character, and the character is worth knowing before we step inside. The Prince Regent was born George Augustus Frederick on the 12th of August, 1762, the eldest son of King George III and Queen Charlotte. He was, by the standards of any royal childhood, a privileged boy. He was raised at Kew, in the gardens of the royal estate west of London, where his parents kept their summer residence. He was tutored carefully. He was given music and languages and the formal education appropriate to a future king. By his late teens he was, by every contemporary account, a handsome, charming, intelligent, and disastrously self-indulgent young man. He grew up, in the 1780s and 90s, into one of the most flamboyant figures of his generation. He spent enormous sums of money. He accumulated debts that would horrify even a moderately financially literate observer. He kept a string of mistresses. He married privately, in 1785, a Catholic widow named Maria Fitzherbert, in a ceremony that was illegal under the laws of its time, but that he and Mrs. Fitzherbert understood, between themselves, to be a real marriage. He was forced in 1795 to enter into a public dynastic marriage to Princess Caroline of Brunswick, a marriage which broke down almost immediately and which produced one daughter, Princess Charlotte, before the couple separated entirely. He maintained, throughout his adult life, a complicated, tangled set of romantic and domestic arrangements that scandalized the more sober elements of society and that delighted the satirists. He also, separately, had genuine talents and serious interests. He had, as we will see when we get to the conservatory, an exceptional eye for architecture and design. He had a genuine love of music and the visual arts. He patronized painters and silversmiths and architects on a scale that few of his contemporaries could match. The Royal Pavilion at Brighton, the eventual remodelling of Buckingham Palace, the National Gallery, the rebuilding of Carlton House itself, all of these are, in significant part, the work of the man we are about to meet at the head of the table tonight. He was, in his ambitions for taste and beauty, a serious patron. He was also, in his actual life, a man of considerable personal indulgence, considerable charm, and considerable inability to stop spending money he did not have. He waited a very long time for power. His father, George III, was healthy through most of his reign, and the brief episodes of illness that gave the prince hopes of an early regency in the late 1780s and the early 1800s always resolved before any constitutional change was made. The prince spent his 20s and 30s and 40s as a man in waiting, with all the privileges of his position, but none of the actual political authority. By the time the regency was finally established in February of 1811, he was 48 years old, in increasingly poor health himself, and considerably less charming and slimmer than he had been in his youth. He was also finally in charge. The party tonight is the party of a man who has been waiting half a century to throw it. The prince has known, since his late teens, exactly what he wanted his accession to power to look like. He has been planning the staging of it, in various forms, for 30 years. The grand service of gold plate that will be on display tonight has been commissioned, piece by piece, from the silversmith Paul Store and the firm of Rundell, Bridge and Rundell. Since the early 1800s, the room arrangements have been refined and re-refined. The architectural alterations to Carlton House have been made, undone, and remade. The tents in the garden, the canal in the supper table, the lighting, the music, the menu, the seating plan, the order of the entry of the guests. All of this has been planned in detail by the prince personally, in consultation with his architects and his stewards and his chefs, for months. Tonight is the unveiling of the plan. The carriage moves forward another 20 feet. We can now see, ahead of us, the open courtyard in front of Carlton House, with its great Ionic colonnade, the screen of pillars that runs along the front of the building, glowing in the light of the gas lamps that have been specially installed for tonight. We have been waiting in the carriage for nearly an hour. The party is about to begin. The carriage finally turns into the courtyard. The horses' hooves change sound as the wheels move from the stone sets of Pall Mall onto the matting that has been laid over the gravel of the forecourt to protect the surface. The matting is thick coir, brought in by the cartload over the previous week, and it has the thump under the wheels that any surface gives. The horses, slowing to a walk, are guided into the line of carriages now drawing up at the front of the colonnade. The colonnade itself is the first sight that takes the breath. Carlton House was rebuilt by the architect Henry Holland in the 1780s, in the elegant, restrained classical style that the late 18th century preferred, and the centerpiece of the rebuild was the long Corinthian colonnade that runs along the front of the courtyard. The pillars are tall, perhaps 30 feet high, fluted in the pale stone that catches the evening light. There are 6 of them around the central pediment, with side wings extending in either direction. Tonight, every pillar has been wreathed with garlands of flowers and evergreen branches. The capitals at the top of each pillar have been hung with ornaments that catch the lamplight. The whole colonnade, lit from below by the new gas lamps that have been installed under the portico, is one of the most striking architectural objects in the whole of London at this moment. The gas lamps are themselves a wonder. This is the first major public use of gas lighting at any private event in London. Gas lighting, as a technology, has been demonstrated in various forms for several years, but the lighting of the Carlton House portico tonight is its first ceremonial application on a large scale. The lamps are brighter than oil lamps. They are steadier. They throw a clean white light rather than the yellow of oil. The effect on the colonnade above them is to make the stone glow in a way that no previous lighting could have achieved. Guests who have never seen gas lighting before are, by various contemporary accounts, startled by it. They notice the steadiness. They notice the absence of the flickering that oil lamps always have. They notice the different colour of the light. It is, in its way, a glimpse of the next century at the entrance of the great party of this one. The bandstand has been erected under the great portico to one side of the main entrance. As we draw up, we can hear the band playing. They are a military band, in full dress uniform, perhaps 30 musicians strong, with horns and woodwinds and drums. They are playing a march in the formal ceremonial style then, a version of march that has been written for royal occasions for 2 centuries. The music carries clearly along the courtyard. It rises above the sounds of the carriages and the horses and the murmur of the guests already arrived and waiting in groups under the colonnade. The music, more than anything else so far, announces that something formal and significant is happening. Our carriage reaches the front of the queue. A footman in royal livery, in scarlet and gold with the gold lace and the white silk stockings that royal liveries had at this period, steps forward and opens the carriage door. He bows. He puts down a folding step. We climb out. The first thing that strikes you, stepping out of the carriage, is the sound. Inside the carriage, the world had been muffled. Outside, on the matting of the courtyard, with the music coming from the bandstand and the voices of the guests on the colonnade and the clatter of the carriages still arriving, and the rhythm of the horses' hooves, the world is loud. It is the loudness of a public ceremony. It is not unpleasant. It is, in fact, exhilarating, as any well-organized public ceremony is exhilarating to the senses of someone who has stepped into it from a space outside. The second thing that strikes you is the smell. The matting of the courtyard has the dry coir smell of new fibre, with the faint horse and leather smell of the carriages drawn up nearby. The flowers wreathed on the colonnade are putting out their evening scent. The pinks, the roses, the lilies, the cut flowers from the great market gardens of West London, arranged in garlands by professional florists earlier today. The gas lamps themselves, which are brighter than oil lamps, also have their own faint smell, a not quite pleasant chemical note that is the price the period paid for the brighter light. Above all this, the perfumes of the guests, hundreds of them already arrived and gathered under the colonnade, eau de toilette and pomades, and the heavy floral notes of the favourite perfumes of the season, all mixing in the summer air into the complex composite scent of any large evening gathering. The third thing that strikes you, as you look around the courtyard while the next carriage draws up behind you, is the visual richness. The guests, in their evening clothes, are themselves a spectacle. The men in dark coats and pale waistcoats, The women in the slim Regency gowns in white and ivory and pale silk, the diamonds and pearls catching the gaslight at the throats and the wrists and in the hair, the long white kid gloves, the silk slippers, stepping carefully on the matting, the fans in motion against the heat, the courtyard, in the few minutes one stands in it before going inside, is already a moving picture of the late Georgian high society at its most carefully presented. There are perhaps 200 guests visible from where we are standing, and another carriage load arrives every few minutes. We walk toward the entrance. A line of guards, a phalanx of yeomen of the guard, in their distinctive scarlet and gold tunics with the white ruffs at the throat and the black caps with the red ribbons, are stationed in 2 ranks along the route from the colonnade to the great front doors. The yeomen are the personal bodyguard of the sovereign, a body whose origins go back to the reign of Henry VII, and their presence tonight signals, more than any other detail, that this is a ceremonial occasion of royal weight. The yeomen stand at attention. They do not speak. They do not move. As we walk between their ranks, we can see the details of their uniforms, the gold braid, the embroidered Tudor roses, the partisan staves they hold upright in their right hands. The whole arrangement is the ceremonial declaration that we are now entering, in some formal sense, royal space. The doors of Carlton House are open. They are tall, double, panelled, painted glossy black, with the royal arms in gilded relief above. We step through. The Grecian Hall is the first room you enter. It is one of Henry Holland's masterpieces, and it functions, in the architectural plan of the house, as the threshold between the public outside world and the more private interior. The hall is large, perhaps 40 feet square, with a high ceiling and a stone-flagged floor. The walls are lined with marble pillars, fluted in the cool grey-green of the rare Italian marble that Holland sourced specifically for the room. The ceiling is coffered, with each coffer painted in classical motifs in colours. The whole effect is of stepping inside the entrance hall of a Greek temple, transposed to central London by an architect who had spent considerable time studying the originals. Tonight, the hall is full of people. Guests are arriving at the rate of 2 or 3 per minute. They are being received by stewards in royal livery who direct them onward through the suite of reception rooms beyond. The hall is alive with the sound of voices. The voices echo slightly off the marble and the stone with the bright acoustic that any hard-surfaced classical space produces. There are perhaps 50 people standing in the hall at any given moment, in clusters, the men greeting each other, the women exchanging the polite kisses on the cheek that the period permitted between close acquaintances. There is the rustle of silk dresses moving against silk. There is the clack of fans opening and closing. There is, very faintly, from somewhere deeper in the building, the sound of another band, a smaller orchestra this time, playing something light and danceable. Above the hall, suspended from the centre of the ceiling, is a chandelier of enormous size, lit with hundreds of beeswax candles. The candles, freshly lit perhaps half an hour ago, are throwing the yellow light of beeswax throughout the entire interior of the hall. The light is dramatically different from the gaslight outside. It is warmer. It is gentler. It is also, by virtue of the sheer number of flames, considerably hotter. The temperature in the hall is already significantly warmer than the summer air outside. By the end of the evening, it will be considerably warmer still. We are directed by a steward to continue forward into the suite of reception rooms beyond. I want to describe these rooms because they are, as a sequence, one of the great achievements of late Georgian interior decoration, and the modern visitor cannot see them. Carlton House was demolished in 1826, 15 years from tonight. The rooms we are about to walk through have not existed for 2 centuries. The descriptions that survive in the contemporary accounts of guests at the fête, in the architectural records of Holland's office, in the watercolour studies that were made of the rooms in the 1810s, are the only way we have of imagining them. We are walking through rooms that by the time you and I are alive have ceased to exist for very many decades, but on this evening they exist completely. The first room beyond the Grecian Hall is the saloon at the foot of the great staircase. The prince has had this saloon temporarily reconfigured for the evening into something quite extraordinary. It has been turned into a grotto. A grotto, in the 18th century sense, is a deliberately constructed cave-like space, usually with rocky walls, mosses, ferns, and water features, designed to evoke the cool dim of a natural cave. Grottos were a fashionable feature of formal gardens through the 1700s, and several great country houses had permanent ones. The prince has had a temporary grotto built inside the saloon at Carlton House just for tonight. The walls of the saloon have been covered with simulated rock panels. The corners have been planted with real ferns and mosses brought in from the country and arranged by the prince's gardeners. The lighting has been deliberately dimmed, with only a few lamps placed behind the rock panels to provide a greenish underglow. The effect is of stepping out of the bright marble hall into a cool, dim cave with the sound of running water. There is a fountain in the centre and the faint smell of damp moss and ferns. It is a piece of pure theatre. It serves no practical function. It is simply the Prince Regent declaring, in the second room of the evening, that this is going to be a kind of party where every space has been designed and dressed for effect. We pass through the grotto. The transition from the bright hall to the dim grotto and out again into the next room is exactly the character of theatrical surprise that the architects and designers of the age delighted in. We emerge blinking into the next room. The next room is the Crimson Drawing Room, one of the principal reception spaces of the house, and one of the rooms in which the prince has invested the most architectural attention over the years. The walls are hung with crimson silk damask, the deep blood red of expensive woven silk, woven in Lyon in the 1790s, and brought to England by way of one of the few legal trade channels that operated through the long French wars. The damask is patterned with the classical motifs that the prince favoured: laurel wreaths, palm leaves, stylized vases, all woven into the fabric in a darker red than the ground colour. The effect on the walls is of a deep saturated red surface that absorbs the candlelight rather than reflecting it, giving the whole room an enveloping quality. The furniture in the Crimson Drawing Room is extraordinary. There are tables and cabinets in ebony and ivory, in the elaborate marquetry style that the prince admired, the dark, glossy ebony inlaid with the precise pieces of pale ivory in patterns of birds and flowers and classical figures. There are vases, Chinese, Etruscan, Greek, on every surface that will hold a vase. The Chinese vases are the great blue and white porcelains of the Kangxi period, brought to England by the East India Company over the previous century. The Etruscan vases are the deep black figure pieces, with the orange figures of warriors and athletes painted on the black ground. The Greek vases purchased by the prince's agents from the great Italian collections are the larger amphorae and craters, with the deeper ornamental scenes of mythological subjects. There are paintings on every wall not occupied by a doorway, including several Dutch masters that the prince has acquired over the previous decade. There is a Rembrandt of an interior scene hung over one of the cabinets. There is a Vermeer-like Dutch interior on the wall opposite. There is a great Rubens of a mythological subject above the fireplace. The prince's eye for paintings, even at this comparatively early stage of his collecting career, is already remarkable. He buys when he buys the best examples available. The collection in this single room, by 1811, would be the envy of any major private picture gallery in Europe. There are gilded chairs around the perimeter of the room, with crimson velvet cushions matching the wall hangings. They are the portable formal chairs that the period used for receiving, straight-backed, lightly built, with the elaborate gilding on the wooden frames that the period preferred. In the centre of the ceiling, another huge chandelier, this one in cut crystal, is throwing rainbow shards of light in the walls and the floor as the candles flicker. The crystal chandelier is of recent manufacture, ordered by the prince specifically for this room, with hundreds of individual cut crystal pendants suspended in tiers from the central frame. As the candles in the chandelier flicker, the movements of the flames are amplified by the cut crystal into the shifting rainbow patterns that move through the walls of the room. The room is full of people. There are perhaps 200 guests in this room alone, in clusters, talking. The conversation at this moment is the conversation of polite society at the start of an evening comments, on the heat, on the journey, on the carriages, on who has and has not arrived, on the rumours of what the supper is going to be. The voices, in the acoustic of the silk-hung walls, are gentler than they had been in the marble Grecian hall. The damask absorbs the sound. The room feels, despite the number of people in it, less echoing and more intimate than any of the rooms we have passed through so far. Champagne is being circulated by servants in royal livery, who move through the crowd with trays of crystal glasses, each glass full of the pale gold sparkling wine that has by the early 1800s become the fashionable summer drink of the English upper classes. The champagne is iced. It has been kept in cellar ice for the previous 24 hours, and the glasses, when they reach the guests, are still cold to the touch, with drops of condensation on the outside of the crystal that catch the candlelight. We take a glass each, you and I, in our imagination. The glass is light and cold in the hand, the wine. When you sip it, is the dry, sharp sparkle of good champagne with the fine bubbles that the period's better houses produced. The cold of the wine, in the room, is a physical pleasure. The whole room, the crimson walls, the candlelight, the music coming from somewhere deeper in the house, the murmur of voices, the cool wine in the cold glass, is the shape of sensory environment that the 18th century designed its great houses to produce. We have, in the world we are imagining, fully arrived. Walk a few steps further into the room. Stand in front of the Rubens above the fireplace for a moment. The painting is large, perhaps 8 feet across, with the fleshy colours that Rubens was known for, and in the candlelight from the chandelier above, the colours seem to glow with a depth that the daylight could never quite match. The prince has an eye for the way candlelight transforms paintings. Many of the great picture rooms from the period were designed specifically for evening viewing, on the assumption that the paintings would look better by candle than by sun. The Crimson Drawing Room on this evening is doing exactly what its designer intended it to do. Beyond the Crimson Drawing Room is the Throne Room, which the prince has had specially redecorated for the Regency. This is the room in which, in formal ceremonial terms, he has been receiving foreign ambassadors and the senior officers of state since February. Tonight it is open to the guests. The throne itself, an elaborate carved and gilded chair, upholstered in crimson velvet, with the royal arms above the back, stands on a dais at one end. The walls are lined with portraits of British monarchs from the previous 2 centuries. Charles I, the executed king, looks down from one wall in the famous Van Dyck composition. Charles II hangs across from him, The great Tudor portraits of Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, copied from older originals, are placed in the central panels above the throne. The Stuart and Hanoverian kings line the other walls in their various ceremonial poses. The ceiling is painted with allegorical figures in pastel colours. Britannia attended by justice and wisdom and plenty, in the sort of formal allegorical composition that the period favoured for ceremonial spaces. The prince is not yet in the throne room. He is, by the household routine for the evening, still in his private apartments upstairs, dressing for the formal entry that will happen at a later hour. He will descend, when he descends, with appropriate ceremony. For now, the throne room is open to guests, but the throne itself is empty. Several guests are admiring the portraits. A group is examining the ceiling. 2 or 3 are standing with their backs to the throne, talking quietly, with the casual attitude that close intimates of the host can permit themselves in his absence. A young man in a guards officer's uniform is showing his sweetheart, on his arm, the carved cipher of George III on the back of the empty throne, pointing it out with the possessive pleasure that the courtier has always taken in showing the heart of the court to someone who has not seen it before. Beyond the throne room is the circular dining room. This room is one of the architectural curiosities of Carlton House. It is genuinely circular, perhaps 40 feet across, with a domed ceiling, 8 tall windows around the curved walls, and a floor of polished oak parquet. The dining table that normally stands in the centre has been removed for tonight. The room is being used as one of the promenade spaces where guests can walk in circles, talking, before moving on to other rooms. The acoustic in a circular room is unusual. Voices carry around the curve of the wall in ways with a whispering effect that makes a conversation on the far side of the room audible to a listener on the near side, despite the distance. The room is full of the interesting acoustic effects that you only get in such spaces, and several of the guests, noticing the effects, are amusing themselves by speaking softly over the room and listening for the echoes that come back. We do not stay long in any of these rooms. The route through the suite is a procession, and the guests are flowing forward through it like a river, propelled partly by the architecture itself and partly by the direction of the stewards. We move on. The next room is the music room, where the dance band that we heard distantly from the Grecian Hall is playing now in person, with perhaps 15 musicians in formal evening dress, arranged at one end of the room, and a few couples already moving around the polished parquet in the opening dances of the evening. The musicians are professionals, hired for the night from the better London orchestras, and they are playing with the precision that the period's professional dance bands maintained. The first violin has the concentration of a man who has been hired to play for several £1,000s across a number of occasions over the year, and who knows that tonight, more than most occasions, will be observed and commented on. The dancers are beginning the long sequence of country dances that will continue, off and on, through the evening. Sir Roger de Coverley, The Devil's Dream, Mrs. Casey's Reel, the cycle of figures and turns that the period's dance instructors had standardized along the country. We move on. The next room is one of the smaller drawing rooms, hung with green silk and lit with smaller chandeliers. The green of the silk is the deep, clean green of an ornamental garden in late summer, and the room, by virtue of the colour, has a cooler register than the rooms we have just been through. There is an Aubusson carpet on the floor, woven in greens and creams and pale pinks. There are smaller paintings on the walls, mostly landscapes, in carved gilt frames. There are perhaps 30 guests in this room, in clusters, and the conversation is quieter than in the larger rooms. We move on. The progression of rooms is the deliberate experience that the prince has constructed for his guests. Each room has its own character. Each room has its own colour, its own lighting, its own arrangement of furniture and art. The cumulative effect of moving through them is the cumulative effect of being shown, slowly and in detail, the whole interior aesthetic of one of the wealthiest and most discriminating private patrons belonging to that world. The rooms are, in the pure sense, a personal manifesto. The prince is saying, room by room, this is what I have built. This is what I am. This is what the Regency under my direction is going to look like. We walk on, I want you to stop in our imagination, somewhere in the middle of the suite of rooms, say in the music room, where the band is playing and the floor is starting to fill with dancers, and just stand for a moment, taking in the experience of being inside this party. Because the experience itself, separately from the rooms and the decorations, is one of the things that the Carlton House Fête is most famous for, and it is worth describing in some detail. The first thing you notice, just standing in the middle of the room, is the heat. The heat is the great theme of the evening. It has been a hot June by London standards. The day has been warm. The interior of the house has been collecting warmth all afternoon. Now, with thousands of beeswax candles lit in the chandeliers and the wall sconces of every room, with 2,000 people in evening dress packed into a finite number of square feet of interior space, with the windows mostly closed against the dust of Pall Mall, with the air rising and the humid breath of the crowd condensing on the cooler upper surfaces, the temperature inside Carlton House has risen well above the temperature outside. The contemporary accounts speak of the heat with one voice. It was uncomfortable. It became more uncomfortable as the evening progressed. By the time the supper was served several hours from now, it would be approaching genuinely punishing. Open your fan. In our imagination, move it gently in front of your face. The breath of air it produces is the immediate relief that fans, in any hot room of any era, provide. The fans from that era are made of carved ivory or sandalwood or tortoiseshell with painted silk or paper between the ribs. The painted scenes on the silk are the ornamental subjects of its time pastoral landscapes, Greek mythological figures, bouquets of flowers. As you move the fan, the painted scene moves with it, and the breeze you create catches the perspiration at your temple and cools it momentarily. The second thing you notice is the smell. The smell of the room is the composite smell of 200 people in heat. Underneath everything, the human note that any large gathering in a hot room produces, and that the period standards of hygiene did not entirely conceal. On top of that, the perfumes, and the perfumes are layered, dense, expensive, contradictory. There is the dominant note of orange flower and rosewater, the great female perfumes of the Regency. There is the deeper note of sandalwood and musk from the male colognes. There is the note of pomade in the men's hair, where they have used a scented hair oil to dress their styles. There is, in pockets of the room, the more concentrated note of a single very expensive perfume from a single very fashionable lady whose signature scent fills a bubble of air around her wherever she stands. There is also the smell of the candles. Beeswax candles, when they are burning, produce a honey-like scent that is one of the pleasures of any candlelit room. Beeswax was the most expensive form of candle in the period, used only in the houses of the wealthy and only on important occasions. Tallow candles, which most ordinary households used, smell like rendered animal fat and produce considerable smoke. The Prince Regent has used only beeswax tonight. There must be 5,000 or 6,000 candles burning throughout the whole interior of Carlton House at this moment. The collective faint honey smell mixed in with all the perfumes, is part of the signature scent of the evening. Above that, food. The kitchens have been working for days. The smell of roasting meat, of fresh bread, of pastries, of the great formal sauces of the French cuisine comes drifting from somewhere deeper in the house. We will, eventually, follow that smell to its source. For now, it is just a faint, food-edged undertone in the larger scent composite of the room. There is also, if you stop and listen for it, the sound of the room is a layered composite of all the conversations going on simultaneously around you. Several hundred individual voices in the pitch that polite society uses indoors, all blending into a hum that occupies the lower register of the acoustic. On top of the hum, the brighter notes of laughter when something amuses someone particularly. On top of that, the individual sounds of the room, a glass touching a glass in a toast, the rustle of a silk skirt against a silk skirt as one lady passes another, the clack of a fan opening, the tap of a slipper on the parquet. From an adjoining room, the music of one of the bands carries faintly through the open doors. From much further away, in the gardens, the music of one of the smaller bands in the marquees can also just be heard, very faintly, when the conversation in the immediate area drops to a low. The third thing you notice, after you have stood in the room for a few minutes and your eyes have adjusted to the candlelight and your ears have separated the band music from the conversation, is the quality of the people. 2,000 of them, drawn from the set of roughly 5,000 individuals who, in the early 1800s, made up the political and social elite of Britain, the dukes and marchionesses, the earls and countesses, the senior politicians, both Tory and Whig, the senior officers of the army and navy, the wealthier members of the rising commercial and professional classes who had been admitted to the borders of high society over the previous generation, the visiting foreign aristocracy, the exiled royalty of half of Europe. The clothes themselves are worth noticing in detail. The men, almost universally, are in the dark, long-tailed coats and pale waistcoats and tight breeches that the period required. The colours of the coats are mostly dark, navy, claret, bottle green, black, with the white waistcoat or the pale embroidered waistcoat showing at the chest. The cravats are tied high under the chin in the precise architectural patterns that the period's gentlemen spent considerable time learning to produce. The hair, on most of the men, is dressed with pomade and brushed forward in the windswept style that the Regency adopted from the cropped Roman fashions of the late 18th century. The men in military uniform, and there are many of them given the war, are in the bright scarlet coats of the army officers, or the dark blue coats of the navy officers, with the gold lace and the orders and the medals catching the candlelight. The women are mostly in the slim Regency gowns in white and ivory, and the very pale colours that the period preferred for evening: primrose yellow, pale blue, pale green, pale lilac. The fabric is mostly silk or fine muslin, with the embroidered hems and the puff sleeves, and the high waist directly under the bust. The skirts fall straight to the slipper. The bodices are low cut in the front, the necklines edged with fringe or lace. The hair is dressed up high, in the Greek style, with the ringlets at the temples and the central knot pinned with a comb or a jewelled bandeau. Diamonds are everywhere, at the throat, at the wrists, in the hair, and they catch the candlelight in the bright flashes that diamonds always produce in a room of this kind. The exiled royalty deserves a note tonight, because the official ostensible reason for the party is to honour them. The Bourbon court of France has been living in England, in various states of formal exile, since the fall of the French monarchy in 1793. The senior figure of the exiled court is the Comte de Lille, the future Louis XVIII, the brother of the executed Louis XVI. The Comte and his nephews, and the cluster of French émigré aristocrats who have followed the Bourbon family into exile, have been provided with residences and modest pensions by the British government. They have lived since their arrival in a kind of suspended royalty, kings and princes in name and bearing, but with no kingdom and no political role, waiting for events on the continent to provide them with a way home. Tonight, they are present in significant numbers. The Comte de Lille himself is somewhere in the building, wearing the orders of the French monarchy, attended by a retinue. We may catch a glimpse of him later in the evening at the prince's table. There are also the British figures. Beau Brummel is here, the great arbiter of male fashion of the Regency, the man who has effectively invented the modern dark suit through his personal sartorial example. He is friends with the Prince Regent, has been in fact for several years, although the friendship is by tonight beginning to fray under the pressure of Brummel's tendency to make jokes at the prince's expense in public. This will be the last social occasion at Carlton House to which Brummel is invited. The friendship will deteriorate further over the next 2 years and will end, famously and definitively, in a snub in St. James's Street that will lead, eventually, to Brummel's exile to France in 1816. Tonight, however, he is present. He is, by the standards of male fashion, perfectly dressed, the dark blue coat, the white waistcoat, the tightly tied cravat, the precisely fitted breeches, the polished shoes, and he is, as always, the centre of a group of admiring younger men who imitate his manner of speech and his attitude. Richard Brinsley Sheridan is here, the great playwright and parliamentary orator, by tonight an old man, 60 years old, in declining health and serious financial trouble, but still one of the most brilliant conversationalists in London. He has been a member of the Prince's circle for decades. He is here on the basis of long friendship rather than current political importance. He stands in a group near one of the windows, holding a glass of champagne, telling a story that is making the people around him laugh. The Whig politicians are here in force. The Prince has been associated with the Whig Party for 30 years, and the Whigs have been hoping for years that, when he finally came to power, he would replace the Tory government of Spencer Perceval with a Whig administration of their own. They are here tonight to remind him of those hopes. George Tierney is here. Samuel Romilly, the great legal reformer, is here. Several of the senior Whig peers are here. They are circulating, deliberately, through the rooms, paying their respects, making themselves visible. The Prince, when he descends, will need to acknowledge them. A nod, a word, a brief conversation, without necessarily committing himself to anything. The political theatre of the evening, beneath the social theatre, is the dance between the Prince and the Whigs about what his regency is going to mean for British politics. They will be disappointed. The Prince will, in the event, keep Perceval and his Tory ministers in office. But the disappointment is still in the future. Tonight the Whigs are here, and they are hopeful, and they are paying their respects. The literary figures are here in smaller numbers. Thomas Moore, the Irish poet, is here. He will write later in his diary that the entertainment was worthy of a prince, a phrase that, depending on how it is read, can be taken either as praise or as something more complicated. Lord Byron will, 20 months from tonight, become the most famous poet in England. He is not yet famous. He is 23 years old. He is, however, present at the fête in his capacity as a young aristocrat, walking the rooms with the same anonymity that any young peer of his rank possessed. He will not, in his later writings, make much of having been there. The fête, for Byron, is an early evening in his career rather than an event he chose to remember. And now, the absent guests. Because the absences from this party are, in their way, as significant as the presences. Mrs. Maria Fitzherbert is not here. Mrs. Fitzherbert has been, for 26 years, the prince's most enduring romantic partner. She married him secretly in 1785, in a religious ceremony that was technically illegal under the terms of the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, but that she and the prince understood between themselves to be a real marriage. The relationship has been, throughout its long course, complicated. The prince was forced into his official dynastic marriage to Princess Caroline of Brunswick in 1795 for reasons of state. He returned to Mrs. Fitzherbert afterward. He left her again. He returned again. By the early 1800s, she had become his recognized long-term companion, and although the relationship by 1811 was not what it had been in their youth, she retained a kind of unofficial status as the most senior woman in his personal circle. Until tonight. The prince invited Mrs. Fitzherbert to the fête. She asked, in advance, where she would be seated for the supper. She had assumed, on the basis of the long relationship, that she would be at the principal table near the prince. The prince, conscious that the supper would be observed by the exiled Bourbon court, and that the precedence at the table would be a matter of public visibility, told her that the rules of formal precedence did not permit him to seat her at the principal table. She would have to be seated, with the other guests of her formal rank, at one of the lower tables in the tents. She, on receiving this answer, declined to attend. She felt the seating arrangement as a deliberate snub. She wrote to the prince to that effect. She did not come. She is, on this evening, at her own house in Tilney Street, alone with her household. She has dined privately. She is sitting in her drawing room with a book that she is not reading. She knows as well as anyone in London what is happening at Carlton House at this hour. She knows that the prince, whom she has loved for 26 years, and to whom she considers herself, in the eyes of God if not of the law, married, is at this moment the host of the largest private gathering in British social history, and that she is not at his side. The relationship, although neither party knows it tonight, will resume in some form in the years following the fête. The prince will continue to consider her his most important emotional connection until his death in 1830. But the snub of the seating tonight is the visible turning point in their long relationship, and Mrs. Fitzherbert, sitting in her drawing room in Tilney Street with her book unread on her lap, knows it. The prince's wife, Princess Caroline of Brunswick, is also not here. She has been living separately from the prince for over a decade in a house at Blackheath outside London. She has not been invited. She would not have come if she had been invited. The estrangement is, by 1811, complete and public, and tonight is the type of formal occasion at which her absence is simply assumed. The prince's daughter, Princess Charlotte, is not here. She is 15 years old, the heir presumptive to the throne after her father, and her formal social debut has not yet been arranged. The prince has decided that she is too young to attend. She has been sent to Windsor for the evening to stay with her grandmother, the Queen, who is currently nursing the king through his continuing illness. Princess Charlotte is, by all the accounts that survive, distinctly displeased about this decision. She wanted to come to the fête. She was told that she could not. She is at Windsor, 15 years old, hearing about the party from a distance and wishing she were at it. And the Queen herself, Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, the wife of George III and the mother of the Prince Regent, is not here. The Queen has refused to attend her son's fete. She has refused for 2 reasons. The first is that her husband, the King, is desperately ill, and she does not feel that the family should be celebrating while the King is in such a state. The second, and more particular, is that she disapproves on principle of the scale of her son's spending and the public extravagance of his arrangements. She has written to him expressing her disapproval. She has refused to come. She has also, with the authority of a mother and a queen, forbidden her daughters, her unmarried daughters who still live with her, from attending the princesses are, like Princess Charlotte, at Windsor tonight, with their father in the locked rooms of the castle, and their mother walking the dim corridors of the Queen's apartments. And the fête in London is for them something they will read about in tomorrow's newspapers. The Queen, on this evening, is in her drawing room at Windsor, reading by the light of a single oil lamp, with one of her ladies beside her. The window is open to the summer night. The smell that comes in through the window is the smell of the gardens of Windsor in midsummer, the roses, the lavender, the cool grass, the sweet note of the night-flowering stocks that have been planted along the south terrace. It is a form of garden smell that she has spent her whole adult life living inside. In the next room, her husband, the King, is asleep in a high bed under the watchful eye of one of his attendants. He is 67 years old. He is in the deepest stretch of the illness that began the previous autumn. He does not, in his current state, fully understand where he is. He is comfortable by the arrangement of his household, but he is not present in any meaningful sense. The Queen is reading slowly. She is reading, by the household record, the volume of devotional poetry that she keeps by her bed when she is at Windsor. She does not know, in any direct way, what is happening at Carlton House at this exact hour. She knows the general fact that the fete is taking place tonight. She has decided that she will not let her thoughts go there. She will read her book. She will sit with her lady. She will, in another hour or so, go in to look at her sleeping husband, and then she will go to bed. The absence of the Queen and her daughters is, in its way, a political statement. The Queen of England, in a version of family solidarity that her position normally required, would have come to her son's first major social occasion as regent. She has refused. The newspapers will note this. The satirists will note this. The relationship between the new regent and his mother, which had not been for some years, will be permanently affected. The prince, when he descends to the fete tonight, knows that his mother is at Windsor, beside his ill father, with his unmarried sisters under her supervision, and that she will not come. He proceeds anyway. He has been planning this party for months. He is not going to cancel it because his mother disapproves. There is something quietly poignant, I think, about that division within the family. The mother who would rather have been at home with her plants and her devotional reading and her unmarried daughters around her. The son who is throwing the most expensive party in the history of the British monarchy in central London on this evening. The father in the locked rooms at Windsor who does not, in his current state, know what either of them is doing. The whole shape of the evening rests on those 3 positions, held simultaneously by the 3 principal members of one royal family. Tonight is the son's evening. The mother and the father are absent in different ways. We are about to meet the son. Around midnight, after several hours in which the guests have been arriving, settling, talking, drinking champagne, gathering in the various rooms, The moment for the formal entry of the Prince Regent arrives. The signal is given. The band stop playing. The conversation in the main rooms drops to a low murmur. The crowd, which has been distributed in the suite of staterooms, begins to consolidate near the central doors of the throne room and the music room. Stewards in royal livery move quietly through the crowd, indicating to certain senior guests where they should stand for the entry. There is a quality to the silence that falls in a great room at the moment when the host is about to make a formal entry. The hum of conversation, which has been the constant soundscape of the evening so far, drops away, and what fills its place is a different kind of attention. The alert listening of 2,000 people who are simultaneously focusing on the same point in space. The candles in the chandeliers continue to flicker. The fans of the seated ladies stop moving. The footmen at the perimeter of the room come to attention. The whole vast assembled crowd holds its breath, in a collective held breath that the moment requires. A door opens at the upper end of the throne room, the door that leads from the private apartments of the house into the formal reception spaces. A herald in royal livery announces, in the formal cadence of a court announcement, His Royal Highness the Prince Regent. The prince enters. He is, even in declining middle age, a striking figure when he wishes to be. He is 48 years old. He has put on considerable weight over the years, and by 1811 the contemporary caricaturists are having a field day with his physical bulk. But he is, when seen at his own carefully arranged moment of entry, an imposing presence. He is wearing the full dress uniform of a field marshal of the British Army, scarlet coat, gold lace, white breeches, the sash and orders of the Order of the Garter, the star of the Garter on his breast, the badge of the Bath, the jewelled stars of various other orders pinned to his coat. He has been considerably tailored into the uniform. The effect, taken as a whole, is one of imposing royal magnificence, compromised by the underlying physical reality, but mostly carried by the sheer weight of the regalia and the mastery of the entrance. His face, in the candlelight of the throne room, is carefully composed. He has practiced this entrance, in some form, for 30 years, and he is performing it now with the precise authority of a man who has been preparing for the exact moment. He is conscious of every eye in the room being upon him. He carries himself accordingly. The pause in the doorway is calculated to permit the maximum visual impact. The inclination of the head, when the bow ripples through the crowd, is carefully judged. He is accompanied by a group of personal attendants and senior officers of the household. He pauses in the doorway. He looks at the assembled crowd. The crowd, in the formal practice then, executes a deep bow, the men bowing from the waist, the women curtsying, that ripples outward from the door through the entire room and into the adjoining rooms as the news of his arrival propagates. He nods gravely, in acknowledgement. The bow finishes. The crowd straightens. He moves into the room. He is immediately surrounded. The Comte de Lille, the head of the exiled French royal family, comes forward to greet him formally. The prince inclines his head, takes the Comte's hand, and they exchange a few words in French. The Comte is in his middle 50s, a heavy, dignified man with the sad expression of someone who has been a king in waiting for nearly 20 years, without ever ascending. The two men, the actual regent and the king in exile, stand together for a moment in formal civility, before the Comte steps back and the next senior guest comes forward. The Whig leaders come forward. Tierney, Romilly, the Duke of Devonshire, the Duke of Bedford. They make their formal greetings. The prince responds to each with the warmth of a host who knows that these men are watching him for political signs. He gives nothing away. He is friendly. He is gracious. He is, at this moment, the master of an enormous social occasion, and the political implications can wait. The prince proceeds slowly through the crowd, with his attendants behind him, moving from group to group, exchanging the words with each senior guest in turn. The dance of formal greetings continues for nearly half an hour. The room is hot. The guests are pressed close. The bands have not resumed playing. The whole interior of Carlton House is in the suspended state of a great social occasion that has just received its host and is waiting for him to declare, by his next movement, what is going to happen next. Eventually he gives the signal. The bands begin again. The dancing, which had paused for the entry, resumes. The conversation, which had dropped to a murmur, rises again to the hum of 2,000 people in evening dress. The prince himself, having made his rounds, withdraws toward the dining room where the long table is being prepared and where the supper that is going to be the centerpiece of the entire evening is about to be served. The dancing has begun in earnest now. The principal ballroom for the evening is the Grand Council Chamber, the largest room in the formal suite, which has been cleared of furniture and prepared specifically for the dance. The floor of the room has been chalked, in the 18th century practice, with elaborate arabesque patterns. The chalk is laid down in fine white powder in the gaps of the parquet, in interlacing designs of curving lines and floral motifs, with the initials of the King GR for Georgius Rex at the centre of the room in larger ornamental lettering. The chalking is partly decorative and partly practical. It gives the dancers' silk slippers a friction against the polished oak floor, preventing slips. As the dancing proceeds through the night, the chalk patterns will gradually be scuffed and broken by the moving feet, and by the early hours the elaborate designs of the start of the evening will have been reduced to a general scatter of white powder over the floor. The first dance has been led off by the Earl Percy and Lady Jane Montague. The Earl, Percy, is the heir to the Duke of Northumberland, a young man at the centre of fashionable society. Lady Jane Montague is a young woman of the Manchester family, distinguished by birth and beauty in the standard formula of the age. Their leading of the first dance is, in the social conventions of the time, an honour conferred by the host. The dance they have led off is called Miss Johnstone, a country dance of moderate complexity, with the men and the women in long parallel lines facing each other, and the leading couple performing a sequence of figures down the line before joining the bottom, and a new couple taking over the lead. Around the edges of the ballroom, on conversation stools placed along the walls, sit those guests who are not dancing. The conversation stools are upholstered seats with no backs, designed for short rests rather than long sittings, are in extremely high demand tonight because of the heat. The senior aristocrats, the older guests, the women who have been on their feet since arriving and are beginning to feel it, are competing quietly for the available stools. A duchess or a marchioness who can find an empty stool in this room at this hour is in a position of but real privilege, and once seated, she is unlikely to give the seat up for some time. The dancers themselves are, in the way of any well-choreographed dance, a moving picture. The men in their dark coats and their pale breeches and their white silk stockings, the women in their pale gowns with the puffed sleeves and the ribbon-trimmed hems, all moving in unison through the figures of the country dance, with the band playing the cheerful melody, and the steps of 200 slippers on the chalked floor making a rhythmic shuffle. At one end of the room, the band is on a raised platform, perhaps 20 musicians strong, playing with the precision that the period's professional dance bands maintained. The band leader, with his violin tucked under his chin, watches the floor as he plays, ready to or quicken the tempo to match the dancer's progress through the figures. I want you to stand at the edge of the ballroom for a moment, near one of the open doors that leads to the next room, and watch a single couple as they move through the dance. The woman is perhaps 25, in a gown of pale primrose silk, with a string of pearls at her throat. She is dancing with a man perhaps 30, in a dark blue coat and white waistcoat. They are well matched in height and rhythm. They are holding each other with the formal carriage that the period required, the woman's hand resting lightly on the man's, the eyes meeting only briefly and at the appropriate moments. The figures of the dance carry them down the line and back. They turn, they cross, they return to their places. The dance is a precisely choreographed encounter, repeated thousands of times across thousands of similar evenings in similar houses around the country. And yet, in this instance, in the candlelight of the council chamber on the night of the Prince Regent's Fête, it is the encounter of these two people on this evening. The dance ends. There is a pause. The dancers bow and curtsy to their partners. They retire to the edges of the room. New couples come forward for the next dance. The band begins the introduction. The new dance begins. The whole rhythm of the ballroom is the rhythm of the evening. Dance, pause, dance. Half an hour passes, an hour passes. The candles in the chandeliers burn down by an inch and are not yet replaced. The wax drips occasionally onto the floor below them, where stewards quickly wipe it up before it can mark a guest's slipper. The temperature in the ballroom rises further. The fans of the seated ladies move continuously. The dancers, when they retire to the edges of the room, immediately call for fresh glasses of cold champagne, which are provided by the servants who are circulating through the room with trays. The smell of the room perfumes candles, bodies, the faint chalk dust raised by the dancers' feet, has settled into the dense composite scent that any long evening produces in any closed room. Beau Brummel himself can be seen, when one looks for him, standing at the side of the room near the band, observing the dancing without himself participating. Brummel is not a dancer. He has never been a dancer. He considers dancing, in the elaborate court-influenced styles from the period, to be ridiculous, and he has always declined to participate in the character of formal country dances that are being performed tonight. He is here as an observer, in his perfectly cut coat, with his perfectly tied cravat, with the precise economy of movement that has made him the most imitated man of his generation. Several of the younger dancers are stealing glances at him as they pass, hoping to catch some detail of his clothing or his manner that they might adopt themselves. He notices the glances. He gives no sign that he notices. I want to take you out of the ballroom for a moment while the dancing continues, and out into the gardens. Because the gardens of Carlton House on this evening are, in their own right, a major component of the experience. We pass through one of the side doors that opens onto the south terrace. Stepping out of the hot interior into the cooler night air is, after several hours indoors, an immediate physical relief. The temperature drops by 10 or 15 degrees as we cross the threshold. The air is fresh. The sky overhead is the deep velvet blue of a clear summer night in central London, with the stars visible above the city's buildings even through the haze of coal smoke and lantern light that hangs always over the great city. The gardens of Carlton House run from the back of the house southward, dropping in a slope toward Marlborough House and the open ground beyond. They are not vast, perhaps 3 or 4 acres in total, but they have been laid out with considerable care, with broad lawns, ornamental shrubs, mature trees, and gravel walks. By day, they are one of the more beautiful private gardens in central London. By night, on this evening, they have been transformed into something quite extraordinary. 4 large tents, the size of pavilions, have been erected on the lawn. Each tent is perhaps 200 feet long and 40 feet wide, with the canvas walls drawn down on 3 sides and the open side facing the house. The tents are illuminated from inside by hundreds of oil lamps and candles, hung from the canvas roofs in chandelier-like clusters and arranged along the long supper tables that run down the centres of each tent. Through the open sides of the tents, the yellow interior light spills out onto the lawns, lighting up the grass and the ornamental plantings and the gravel walks. The whole effect, from the terrace where we are standing, is of an encampment of light in the dark of the gardens. The tents are where the bulk of the supper is going to be served. The principal table inside Carlton House, the long table running through the conservatory and across into the dining room, will accommodate 400 guests. The remaining 1,600 guests will eat at the tables in the 4 tents on the lawn. The tables in the tents are already laid. We can see, through the open sides, the long ranks of plates and glasses and silverware running down the tables, with vases of flowers at intervals and candelabra placed along the centres. The whole ensemble has been laid by the prince's stewards in the same deliberate, exacting style as the principal table inside. In addition to the 4 supper tents, smaller marquees have been pitched at intervals along the lawn, each housing one of the smaller bands that will play through the evening. There are perhaps 6 of these smaller bands, distributed throughout the gardens, playing different kinds of music chamber, music in one, folk dance music in another, light operatic excerpts in a third, so that the guests, walking the gardens between dances and waiting for the supper, are accompanied wherever they go by appropriate music. Walk a few yards out in the lawn and stop for a moment. Stand on the grass. The grass underfoot is the cool, well-cut English lawn grass that the gardener has been keeping in trim through the spring and early summer. The matting has not been laid here, only on the gravel paths and the formal walks. The grass is damp with the evening dew that is just beginning to settle. Your slippers are getting damp. You do not mind. Look around. The 4 supper tents glow in their separate corners of the garden, their canvas walls lit from inside by the hundreds of lamps and candles, the open sides facing the centre of the lawn, so that the light spills out toward you wherever you stand. Between the tents, the gravel paths curve in elegant patterns. Along the paths, the lanterns red, green, yellow, blue, are hung at intervals from the lower branches of the trees, and from iron stakes driven into the ground at the corners of the paths. The colours of the lanterns reflect on the grass below them, and on the white slippers and white gloves, and white silks of the guests who walk between them. There are perhaps 1,000 people in the gardens at this moment, distributed through the lawns and the paths and the clusters at the entrances of the tents. They are walking, talking, drinking, looking. Some are gathered in groups, listening to the music from the chamber music marquee. Some are wandering toward the back of the gardens to inspect the orange trees and the ornamental fountains that have been placed at intervals through the planting. Some are standing in pairs, close together, in the dimmer corners of the paths where the lanterns are sparser. In the private moments that any large party permits, strings of lanterns, hundreds of them, have been hung in the trees and along the gravel walks. The lanterns are coloured glass. some red, some green, some yellow, some blue, and they cast pools of coloured light over the lawn and the paths. The effect, walking the gardens at this hour, is of moving through a fairy-lit landscape, with the yellow light of the supper tents in the middle distance, and the jewel-like points of the lanterns scattered through the trees. The prince has spent considerable money on the lanterns. They have been brought in from a specialist supplier in the city. They will, by the end of the evening, mostly have burned out, and the cost of their consumption will be one of the items on the enormous bill that the household will receive over the next several days. Walk a little way down one of the gravel paths. The paths have been freshly raked this morning, and the white gravel crunches softly underfoot in how gravel always crunches in any well-kept garden. The trees overhead are old. Some of the limes and the chestnuts have been standing here since the early 1700s, when the property was first laid out, and the canopy throws the lanterns into and out of darkness as a breeze moves through the leaves. The smell here, away from the heat of the house and the close perfumes of the crowd, is the smell of a London garden on a summer night. Grass, the scent of the night-flowering jasmines and stocks, the deeper smell of damp earth from the borders that the gardeners watered earlier in the day, the faint, distant note of the river half a mile to the south. There are guests on the path. 2 ladies in pale gowns are walking ahead of us, talking quietly. A gentleman in a dark coat is standing under one of the lime trees, smoking a cheroot, the red point of the burning tobacco visible in the dimness. Around 10:30, the fireworks begin. The fireworks have been arranged by a professional pyrotechnician hired specifically for the evening. They are launched from a position behind the gardens, on the far side of the boundary wall, where the launchers can work safely without endangering the guests. The display lasts for perhaps half an hour. It is one of the most elaborate fireworks displays London has seen in years. There is a single low whistle from somewhere in the dark beyond the wall, the signal from the lead pyrotechnician to his assistants that the first rocket is ready. Then, with a hissing noise, the first rocket rises from behind the wall, climbing in a thin line of orange sparks against the dark blue sky, and bursts at the top of its arc into a great chrysanthemum of red and silver sparks. The crowd on the lawn looks up. The face of every guest, in the brief flash of light from the burst, is illuminated by the falling sparks. There is a collective sound from the crowd, not quite a gasp, not quite a sigh, the involuntary exhalation that human beings have always made at the moment of any spectacular fireworks burst. The single rocket is followed by a second, then a third, then a sequence of them in rapid succession. There are rockets that rise from behind the wall and burst in the sky overhead, in showers of red and silver and gold sparks. There are Roman candles that fire balls upward at intervals. There are Catherine wheels mounted on poles, spinning in showers of coloured fire. There are set pieces, large frames mounted on stakes, on which the gunpowder has been laid out in patterns to spell out the initials GR or the royal coat of arms or various flower designs that ignite in sequence and burn brightly for a minute or two before fading. There are the deeper boom and shower patterns that the largest aerial fireworks produced in the period. The smell of gunpowder drifts down around the gardens. It is the acrid, sulphurous smell that gunpowder produces, with an additional note of the chemical mixtures that the period's pyrotechnicians used to colour their burst strontium for red, copper for blue, sodium for yellow. The smoke from the fireworks rises up into the night sky in grey-white plumes that catch the light of the fireworks themselves before dispersing into the higher air. The plumes drift slowly to the east on the evening breeze. By the end of the display, a faint haze of fireworks smoke will hang over the eastern part of central London, drifting slowly toward the city and dispersing into the higher air. The guests, gathered on the terraces and the lawns, watch with the upward tilted faces and the open mouths and the involuntary exclamations of pleasure that fireworks have always produced in human audiences, regardless of period. There is, in particular, the involuntary "oh" that a successful aerial burst produces, the shape of burst that fills a large area of the sky with cascading colour for several seconds before fading. The crowd produces this "oh" perhaps a dozen times during the display. The pyrotechnician beyond the wall, listening for it, knows by the sound of it whether his work is succeeding. Now, this is the sort of pure spectacle that the 18th century had brought to its highest level, the combination of gunpowder, choreography, and the dark summer sky as a stage. The Prince Regent, watching from the central terrace with the senior guests around him, is in his element. This is the type of public celebration he has been imagining for 30 years. The fireworks are, in their way, the visible aerial signature of the new regime he intends to preside over. The display ends after perhaps half an hour with a final rocket that sends a large burst of red and gold sparks along the sky. The smoke clears slowly. The guests applaud. The bands in the smaller marquees, which had paused for the duration of the fireworks, resume playing. The whole vast machine of the evening picks up again where it had paused, and the next phase, the long approach to the supper that is the centre of the night, begins. We go back inside. The contrast between the cool fresh air of the gardens and the dense hot air of the interior is, on the way back in, even sharper than it had been on the way out. We are pressed again into the crowd of 2,000 bodies in evening dress in a finite number of rooms. I want to take you briefly into one of the smaller corridors that connects the principal rooms, because something happens here that I think captures one of the smaller honest realities of the evening. The corridor is hot. It is, in fact, hotter than the ballroom, because there is no cross-ventilation and no high ceiling to absorb the heat. The walls are painted a pale colour and lined with portraits and marble busts on plinths. There are perhaps 30 or 40 guests in this corridor at any given moment, mostly people who are moving between rooms or who have stepped aside for a moment of relative privacy. Among them, leaning against one of the walls in an alcove, is an older lady in a pale silk gown that I want to describe. She is perhaps 60 years old, of the high aristocratic class that the period preserved most carefully, and she is suffering. She has been on her feet for several hours. The heat has been considerable. Her gown, which was beautifully fresh when she arrived, has begun to show the signs of an evening of continuous wear. The silk crumpled at the back, the spots where someone has bumped against her with a glass. Her face, in the light of the wall sconce above her, is flushed. Her fan, which she is moving steadily, is doing what it can. She is, by every visible sign, exhausted, but she has not yet found a chair, and she has not yet decided to leave. A younger woman, perhaps her daughter or her companion, is standing beside her, holding a glass of cold water that has been brought from the supper preparations. The older lady takes the glass, drinks slowly, hands it back. She closes her eyes for a moment. The younger woman watches her with the attention of someone who is responsible for an older relative at a difficult event. After a moment, the older lady opens her eyes again, smiles, gives a nod, and the two of them move on, slowly, toward the next room. The private moment in the corridor lasts perhaps 30 seconds. It will not be in any of the official accounts of the evening. It is a form of private moment that is, however, repeated thousands of times throughout the rooms of Carlton House on this night. This is the other reality of the Carlton House Fête. The guests are uncomfortable. The heat is genuinely unpleasant. The rooms are too full. The supper is hours away. Many of the guests, the older ones and those in the most elaborate clothes, are already ready to go home. They will not, however, go home. They will stay until the supper has been served, because to leave before having seen the supper would be to miss the centrepiece of the evening, and to miss the centrepiece of the evening would be to have wasted, in social terms, a great opportunity. There is, in this corridor, the private acknowledgement that the great event is also, in lived experience, a considerable physical ordeal. The older lady in the alcove will, in another moment, push herself off the wall, square her shoulders, smile at a passing acquaintance, and continue her evening. She knows what she is doing. She has been to many great events. She will get through this one. I want to spend a few minutes, while the guests are gathering for the supper, on the man who has built all of this, because the Prince Regent's life arc, by tonight, is a long and complicated one, and it is worth understanding before we sit down at his table. He was born, as I mentioned earlier, in 1762, the eldest son of George III and Charlotte. He grew up at Kew, on the royal estate west of London. His childhood was, by the standards of any royal childhood belonging to that world, exceptionally well supervised. His father, the king, was a serious and conscientious man who took the upbringing of his children with real care. The prince and his brothers were tutored carefully. They were given the formal education appropriate to their rank. They were expected to behave with dignity. They were allowed to play in the gardens and the deer park, but they were also, from a very young age, drilled in the responsibilities of royal life. The young prince was, by every account, an intelligent and charming child. He was quick, he was musically talented, he learned languages easily. He was, by his early teens, a young man of considerable promise. He was also, very early, constitutionally unsuited to a version of disciplined royal life that his father wanted to impose on him. He liked pleasure. He liked company. He liked late nights. He liked the character of fashionable Whig society that his father, a serious Tory, despised. By his late teens he was beginning to drift into the shape of life. The gambling, the spending, the romantic entanglements that would define the rest of his existence. By his early 20s, he was already deeply in debt. The first of many parliamentary settlements of the prince's debts came in 1787, when he was 25. There would be many more. By the end of his life, the cumulative cost of his debts to the British taxpayer would run into many millions of pounds in modern values. He was, throughout his adult life, a man who spent more than he had, and who relied on the willingness of Parliament and his father to repeatedly absorb the consequences. His personal life was, throughout the same period, complicated. There were several mistresses in his late teens and 20s, including the actress Mary Robinson, who held a place in his early affections. There was, in 1785, the secret marriage to Mrs. Maria Fitzherbert that we have already discussed. There was, in 1795, the disastrous formal marriage to Princess Caroline of Brunswick. There were before, during, and after these primary relationships other connections. Lady Jersey, Lady Hertford, who is currently his companion, and various others. The pattern was a familiar one for royal princes from that era. a public dynastic marriage that did not work, a series of more emotionally significant private connections, and the accumulation of complicated half-acknowledged domestic arrangements. He was also, in ways that are sometimes underappreciated, a serious patron of the arts. He commissioned major architectural work, Carlton House itself, the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, the early stages of what would become Buckingham Palace. He bought paintings on a substantial scale, including the great Dutch and Flemish masters that form the core of the royal collection. He commissioned silver from the best silversmiths of Europe, including the grand service that we will see at the supper table tonight. He was a discerning collector. His taste, in the judgment of art historians who have studied it, was genuine, sophisticated, and at the leading edge of what the period had to offer. By the time the Regency was finally established in February of 1811, he was 48 years old. He was overweight. He was suffering from gout and other physical ailments. He was estranged from his wife and from his daughter. He was at odds with his mother, who disapproved of nearly everything about his life. He was, however, finally in charge. I want to spend a moment on the relationship between the prince and his mother, because it is the private fault line that runs underneath the public drama of tonight. And that Charlotte and George, mother and son, had not in their younger years been close. The Queen had borne 15 children. Her attention in the 1760s and 70s and 80s had been distributed across all of them, with the eldest son receiving no preferential warmth. The prince, as he grew up, had drifted into the Whig circles that his Tory father despised, and his mother, who was a serious woman with strong moral views, had disapproved on principle of his early reckless habits. The disapproval had hardened over the years into a kind of permanent guarded distance. The relationship between them by the early 1800s was correct, formal, occasionally affectionate at private moments, and fundamentally cold. The fête tonight has crystallized the coldness into something close to public estrangement. The Queen has refused to come. The Prince has proceeded anyway. The newspapers will note tomorrow that the Queen of England was not at her son's first major fête. As regent, the satirists will note it. The political class will note it. The relationship will not recover. The Queen will continue, for the next 7 years, to attend her ill husband at Windsor and at Kew, with her unmarried daughters at her side, while her son, in central London, builds the public spectacle of the Regency to ever larger scales. The two halves of the family will live, by 1811, in worlds that have ceased to overlap in any meaningful way. There is something quietly characteristic about the division. The mother who could be content with a garden, a harpsichord, a few favourite plants, an evening with her closest companions. The son for whom none of those things were enough, for whom the only adequate stage was a public one, with 2,000 witnesses, and gold, and music, and the visible insignia of state. They were the same family. They were not, in their basic temperaments, the same kind of person. The fête tonight is, in part, the largest possible expression of the difference. The party tonight is the announcement of that fact. It is the moment at which the long-deferred ambition of his life finds, in an enormous public spectacle, its first formal expression. The man who descends the staircase tonight in his field marshal's uniform, who greets the Comte de Lille and the senior Whigs and the great hosts of the evening, who watches the fireworks from the central terrace, who will sit at the head of the 200-foot table when the supper is served. This is the man who has been waiting for this moment since his teens. He has built it. He has paid for it. He is, in the world we are imagining, our host. We are about to sit down at his table. It is now nearly 2:30 in the morning. The dancing in the council chamber has been going for nearly 3 hours. The fireworks are over. The guests in the gardens have been circulating between the supper tents and the smaller marquees, with the bands playing and the coloured lanterns swinging gently in the night breeze. Inside the house, the ballroom has emptied as the dancers have begun to drift toward the conservatory and the great dining room beyond it, where the supper is about to be served. The prince has positioned the supper at this hour deliberately. The whole evening has been built as a long ascending sequence: the arrival, the rooms, the dancing, the fireworks, culminating in the supper itself, which is the centerpiece. The supper, served in the early hours of the morning, when the guests have already been at the party for 6 or 7 hours, is meant to land as the climactic moment, the architectural high point, the thing the whole evening has been building toward. And it is going to land, by every contemporary account, exactly as the prince intends. We follow the flow of the crowd toward the conservatory. The walk from the council chamber, where the dancing has just ended, to the conservatory, where the supper is about to begin, takes us through a sequence of rooms we have not yet seen. The prince has, with characteristic care, designed the route specifically, so that the guests pass through a series of escalating impressions before arriving at the table. The first room we pass through is hung with pale blue silk and lit only by a few lamps placed low along the walls. The dimness, after the bright candlelight of the ballroom, allows the eye to adjust. The next room is hung with darker damask and lit more brightly. The next room is bright and gold. The eye is being prepared by the deliberate gradient of the lighting for the full revelation that is coming. At the threshold of the conservatory, the line of guests slows. Those at the front of the line, stepping into the conservatory and seeing the table for the first time, are stopping involuntarily to take in the spectacle. Several of them are exclaiming. The line backs up. The guests behind, hearing the exclamations, lean forward to see, and the cumulative effect is the propagation of an ascending wave of astonishment from the front of the line backward. By the time we reach the threshold, we know roughly what to expect, but the actual sight, when we step through the doors, exceeds the rumour of it. The Gothic conservatory at Carlton House is one of the architectural wonders of late Georgian London. It was built by Thomas Hopper, a young architect whom the prince had commissioned specifically for the project, in the style of late medieval English Gothic, an unusual choice for a room of its kind, because conservatories were normally built in classical styles, but a choice that the prince found exciting and that the architect executed with brilliance. The conservatory is a long, high-vaulted room, perhaps 100 feet long and 30 feet wide, with a soaring ribbed vault overhead supported on slender clustered columns of cast iron painted to look like stone. The walls are pierced with tall pointed Gothic windows, glazed with clear glass and panels of stained glass at the tops, like a medieval cathedral. The whole space is, in effect, a private cathedral built specifically for the cultivation of plants. Tonight, for the supper, the plants have been arranged for maximum visual effect. There are tall palms in tubs along the walls, the long arched fronds reaching up toward the vault. There are flowering camellias in pots between the columns, the white and pink blooms standing out against the dark, glossy foliage. There are jasmines and gardenias in smaller pots on tables, releasing their scent into the air, the deep, sweet floral notes that perfumers had long since learned to extract and bottle, but that, here, are released directly from the living flowers. There are orange and lemon trees in tubs at intervals, with the ripe fruit visible among the leaves. The floor is paved with stone. The whole interior is illuminated, for tonight specifically, by hundreds of crystal lamps suspended from the ribs of the vault, each lamp containing several wicks burning in scented oil and casting a cool light that filters down through the cut crystal in rainbow shards. The candelabra of the ballroom, which had been throwing the yellow of beeswax candles, are nowhere here. The conservatory is lit, by deliberate choice, with a different and cooler register of light. The effect, stepping into it, is of moving from one season into another, from a hot summer afternoon into a cool, clear evening. A hearth. But the centerpiece of the conservatory, and the central architectural object of the entire fête, is the supper table. The table runs the entire length of the conservatory and continues beyond, through the doors at the far end, into the great dining room beyond. The total length of the table, end to end, is 200 feet. It is wide enough, perhaps 4 feet across, to accommodate the elaborate place settings that are laid along its length. It can seat, in total, perhaps 400 guests, 200 along each side. Tonight, only the principal guests of the evening will be seated at this table, the most senior aristocrats, the senior politicians, the exiled Bourbon court, the closest personal friends of the prince. The remaining guests will eat at the tables in the tents in the garden, where the food is being served simultaneously, and where the same standard of preparation has been applied. Walk slowly down the length of the table, while the guests are still finding their places. The first thing you notice, just walking along the edge, is the scale of the silver. The entire table is laid with the grand service, the personal gold and silver gilt dinner service that the prince has been commissioning over the previous decade from the silversmith Paul Store and the firm of Rundell, Bridge and Rundell. The grand service is, by 1811, perhaps the most ambitious dinner service in private hands anywhere in Europe. The most recent invoice from Rundell and Bridge, presented to the prince on the 4th of June this year, in preparation for tonight, totalled over £61,000, the largest invoice in the history of the firm. The total cumulative cost of the service by tonight runs into hundreds of thousands of pounds. Every plate on the table is gold. Every charger is gold. Every wine cooler, every salt cellar, every pepper mill, every individual sauce boat is silver gilt. The candelabra placed at intervals along the centre of the table are silver gilt, with the elaborate neoclassical figures of nymphs and satyrs and classical motifs that Paul Store was known for. The serving platters that will arrive when the food is brought are silver. The wine bottles already standing in the wine coolers are silver-cased. The individual finger bowls set at each place are crystal-mounted in silver gilt. The whole table, in the light of the crystal lamps overhead, is a continuous gleaming surface of precious metal, perhaps 200 feet long, broken at intervals by the white linen of the cloth, the green and pink and yellow of the floral arrangements, and the individual splashes of colour from the place cards at each setting. But the central object of the table, the thing that will, after this evening, become one of the most discussed pieces of theatrical excess in British social history, is the canal. A silver-lined canal runs down the centre of the table for almost its entire length. The canal is perhaps 170 feet long, 6 inches above the surface of the table, and 14 inches deep. It has been engineered and built specifically for tonight by the same craftsmen who produced the silver service. The canal is fed, at the head of the table, at the prince's end, by a silver fountain, perhaps 3 feet tall, in the form of a classical urn, from which water flows continuously into the channel below. The water flows the length of the table, between banks of moss and aquatic flowers that have been arranged along the inside of the silver channel to give the appearance of natural river banks. At the far end of the table, the water passes through a series of cascades and into a circular basin surrounded by architectural decorations, where vases burning scented oils give off a delicate perfume that drifts upward and joins the general scent of the room. In the canal, swimming through the bubbling water, are live fish. Gold and silver fish. Goldfish in the modern sense, and silver gudgeons, the native English freshwater fish released into the canal a few hours before the supper. There are perhaps 50 fish in total, swimming up and down the length of the table, weaving through the artificial weeds and over the artificial gravel, performing for the entertainment of the assembled guests, the moving pageant that the prince has imagined for them. The whole effect is unprecedented. No host in Britain, and possibly in Europe, has ever before brought live fish to a supper table in this way. The combination, the silver fountain, the silver-lined canal, the moss banks, the live fish, the scent of the burning oils, the cool light from the crystal lamps overhead, the gold dinner service running the length of the table on either side of the central channel is, at the moment of its first revelation to the assembled guests, a sensory shock of the kind that few of them have ever experienced. Several of the contemporary accounts speak of the moment of arrival at the table, the first sight of the fountain and the canal, in language that suggests genuine astonishment. We arrive at our places. We are seated, in the world of our imagined evening, somewhere in the middle of the long table, on one of the 200 chairs along the side. We can see, in one direction, the prince at the head of the table, just visible in the distance through the crystal lamps and the candelabra. We can see, in the other direction, the cascades at the far end of the table, with the basin and the burning vases. Between us and either end, the canal runs, with fish moving through it, and the gold service gleaming on either side. The chairs are upholstered in crimson velvet. They are not the portable chairs of an ordinary supper. They are formal dining chairs that have been brought in for the occasion, hundreds of them, all matching, all heavy, all comfortable. We take our places. The lady to your right is a duchess in her 30s, in a gown of pale green silk with diamond pendants at her ears. The gentleman to your left is a senior naval officer in full dress uniform, with a broad blue ribbon of the Order of the Bath across his chest. The conversation that begins between the three of you is the polite, formal conversation of an English supper table. The prince's seat at the head of the table is, depending on which contemporary account you read, either a state chair upholstered in crimson Genoa velvet and embroidered with gold, or in another account, a plain mahogany chair with a feather back. The descriptions disagree. What both accounts agree on is that he is unmistakable. He is at the head of the table, with the silver fountain rising directly behind him and the canal flowing toward us down the table from his position. He is, in the architectural geometry of the room, the source. The water flows from where he sits. He is attended by 60 servants. The number is precisely recorded in the contemporary accounts. Of those 67 are personal attendants of the prince himself. 6 are footmen of the king's household in their state liveries. 6 are footmen of the queen's household. The remaining 41 are the household servants of Carlton House, plus a number of additional personnel hired specifically for the evening. The servants stand behind the seated guests at intervals along the table, ready to fill glasses, replace plates, present new dishes, and respond to any request that any guest may make. The presence of the King's footman and the Queen's footman in their state liveries is a piece of ceremonial theatre that is worth understanding. The King's household and the Queen's household are, formally and legally, separate from the Prince Regent's household. The King has his own footmen, who serve him at Windsor and at his other residences. The Queen has her own footmen, who serve her at Kew and at Buckingham House. Tonight, by an arrangement made through the Lord Chamberlain, a contingent of each household has been seconded to Carlton House for the supper. The decision was the Prince's. He wanted, on the night of his first major formal occasion as regent, to have the visible representation of all three royal households, his own, his father's, and his mother's, present at the table. The footmen are wearing the state liveries of their respective households, with the differences in cut and colour and embroidery that distinguish one royal household from another. The eye, looking at the table, can identify which footmen come from which household. The Queen's footmen in particular are present despite the Queen's own absence. The Queen herself has refused to come. Her footmen, on her authority, have been sent. The arrangement is the face-saving compromise that the Lord Chamberlain has worked out between the Queen's stated objection to the fête and the Prince's desire to have her household represented. She has not vetoed the loan of the footmen. They are here. She is not. Behind the Prince, in a tableau that contemporary accounts mention with attention, stands a single figure in a complete suit of medieval armour. The armour is genuine, sourced by the Prince's instructions from one of the historic collections that he had access to as regent, and the figure inside it stands motionless throughout the supper. The armoured figure is, in the theatrical logic of the evening, an element of pageantry. He represents, in the most literal possible way, the long history of the English monarchy. He is simultaneously an absurd touch and a deeply characteristic one. The Prince has a documented love of historical pageantry. He commissions it whenever he can. Tonight, on the evening of his first major fête as regent, he has placed a man in 14th century armour behind his chair as a visible reminder that the line of which he is the heir runs back into the deep past. The man inside the armour is, from the household records, a young soldier from the Prince's personal guard, chosen for his height and his ability to stand still for long periods. He has been briefed in advance on what is expected of him. He is to stand at attention behind the Prince's chair from the start of the supper to the end, without moving, without speaking, with the visor of the helmet down and the gauntleted hands resting on the pommel of the great sword that has been placed in his right hand. The armour is heavy. The room is hot. The young soldier is, by the late stages of the supper, considerably uncomfortable. He has been instructed not to show it. He does not show it. The historical record does not preserve his name, but he stands behind the Prince for several hours in the silent patience of a young man who has been given a duty and who is performing it. The supper itself begins. The food is being prepared by Jean-Baptiste Wattier, the Prince's head chef, a French chef of considerable reputation who has been with the Prince's household for years. Wattier has been working in the kitchens for days. He has, in the course of preparation, supervised the making of hundreds of dishes, each in multiple copies, each in the elaborate French style that the period considered the highest standard of culinary art. The desserts have been prepared separately by a confectioner on loan from the Duchess of Dorset's household, a man who is the acknowledged master of the elaborate sugarwork that high formal dinners required. The food arrives at the table in the formal sequence of an early 19th century formal supper. The first service is the soups and the fish. There are 3 different soups: a clear consommé, a creamy fish soup, and a richer turtle soup, being served simultaneously from large silver tureens at intervals along the table. The footmen serve from the tureens into the gold plates of the seated guests. The fish is a series of preparations, passamon poached in court bouillon, and presented whole on long silver platters with cucumber and lemon garnishes, turbot in a hollandaise sauce, fillets of sole in a delicate butter sauce. The smell of the food, when the first service arrives at the table, is one of the pure pleasures of the evening. The consommé in the silver tureen carries the deep, clear, meaty smell of a perfect clarified stock, the sort of smell that French cooks of its time spent years learning to produce. The cream fish soup smells of butter and shellfish and a note of saffron. The turtle soup, the richest and most fashionable of the 3, has the distinctive savoury smell that turtle soups produce, with the note of Madeira that the prince's chef stirs into the pot at the last moment. The salmon, cool from the court bouillon, smells fresh and faintly of lemon and dill. The turbot in hollandaise has the rich smell of butter and egg yolk and lemon. The whole table, in the first few minutes of the first service, is alive with the smell of French cooking at its most refined. The wines that accompany the first service are white. There is a Chablis of considerable quality from an estate in northern Burgundy, with the faint flinty mineral note that good Chablis carries. There is a Hock, a German Riesling from the Rhine, that the prince has acquired through one of the few merchants who can still supply such things during the wartime trade restrictions. The wines are cold. They have been kept in cellar ice for the previous 12 hours, and the drops of condensation on the outside of the crystal glasses catch the light from the candelabra above. The footman behind your chair pours the Chablis into your glass, then a measure of the Hock into a second glass beside it, then steps back to the position behind your shoulder, where he will stand for the rest of the supper, refilling whenever the glass is half empty. The Duchess to your right is making conversation with the gentleman beyond her, a senior diplomat in formal dress. The conversation is the polite, formal conversation of an English supper table. Comments on the rooms, on the supper, on the music coming faintly from the rooms beyond, on the heat of the evening. The naval officer to your left is telling you, between mouthfuls of consommé, about the current state of the Mediterranean fleet, in language carefully calibrated to the understanding he assumes you to have of the war at sea. You listen, you nod, you drink the Chablis, you watch, between phrases, the fish moving in the silver canal a few feet in front of you. The first service is removed. The footmen come forward in coordinated movement and lift the plates and the tureens away. The table is cleared. There is a brief pause, perhaps 2 minutes, during which the conversation rises to fill the silence of the absence of food. Then the second service begins. The second service is the great roasted meats. Whole roasted joints of beef, of lamb, of veal, are brought to the table on silver platters. The joints have been carved in the kitchen by the chef's own hand into the formal slices that the period required, and they are presented at the table in the carved form, with the sauces accompanying them in silver sauce boats. There are roasted chickens dressed with herbs. There are game birds, partridges, quails, pigeons that the kitchen has been trussing and dressing for the previous several hours. There are pies of various kinds. A great raised pie of veal and ham, a smaller pie of pigeon and forcemeat, a pie of game, the smell of the roasted meat, in concentrated form on the table, is a different smell from the more delicate smells of the first service. It is deeper. It is more elemental. The roast beef in particular, when the silver cover is lifted from the platter directly in front of us, releases a wave of dense, savoury aroma that fills the immediate area of the table. The Duchess to your right closes her eyes briefly and says something appreciative about the smell. The naval officer to your left observes dryly that the kitchens at Carlton House are evidently in good hands. The footman behind your chair places a slice of the beef onto your gold plate with a spoonful of the rich red sauce that accompanies it and steps back. The wines now are red, claret from Bordeaux, in considerable quantity. The wartime trade restrictions have made French wines difficult to obtain through normal channels for years, but the prince's cellar built up over decades, with the patient accumulation of bottles through smugglers and special licenses and the occasional diplomatic favour, contains some of the finest French wine in England. Tonight he has opened generously. The claret is poured into the same gold-mounted crystal glasses, replacing the Chablis. There is also a Burgundy, deeper and more complex, in smaller quantities. There are, for the most senior guests at the head of the table, a few bottles of older fine wine from the prince's personal cellar, opened specifically for tonight and circulated to the closest companions, including a few bottles of an extraordinary old port that has been laid down in the cellar since the 1770s, and that is, by tonight, at the absolute peak of its life. You sip the claret. The wine in your mouth is the deep, complex, savoury fruit and leather flavour that good claret produces, with the bottle-aged complexity that comes from a wine that has been kept in the cellar for 10 or 15 years. It is simply an extraordinary wine. The Duchess to your right, watching you taste it, smiles. The prince's cellar, she says, is one of the best in Europe. He has been laying down for 30 years. The naval officer to your left adds that the wartime smuggling networks, despite the official disapproval, have been responsible for keeping the better French wines flowing into the houses of the senior aristocracy throughout the war. There is, in the comment, the acknowledgement that the war that is killing British soldiers in Spain has not, so far, prevented the British senior aristocracy from drinking French wine. The third service is the entrees and the side dishes, the smaller, more delicate dishes that fill in the gaps between the main meats. There are quenelles of poultry, there are ragouts in delicate cream sauces, there are vol au vents of various fillings, the delicate puff pastry shells holding portions of mushrooms or sweetbreads or shellfish in rich sauces. There are vegetables, asparagus from the prince's kitchen gardens, peas, baby carrots, new potatoes, all dressed with butter and herbs. There are salads with the elaborate French dressings that Wattier favoured. The asparagus, in particular, is the great seasonal pleasure of the supper. It is freshly cut this morning, from the kitchen gardens of the royal household at Frogmore, brought into London by special carriage, dressed with butter and a grating of nutmeg, and served at the table at the perfect height of its season. Through the supper, the conversation around your immediate area of the table proceeds as English supper conversation has always proceeded. The Duchess to your right tells a story about her sister-in-law's house in Yorkshire, a comic story about a dog that ate a hat. The naval officer to your left describes, with appropriate restraint, an incident from the early Mediterranean campaigns of the war, in which his ship was becalmed for 3 days within sight of an enemy frigate that was also becalmed, and the two crews stared at each other in the still water without being able to engage. You contribute, when contribution is required, the comments and the observations that politeness demands. You also, when you can, simply look at the table, at the candelabra, at the canal, at the fish, at the prince in the distance, and let the spectacle proceed around you. And then, the desserts. The desserts are, by the standards then, the great display piece of any formal supper, and the Duchess of Dorset's confectioner has produced a series of architectural sugar pieces that are themselves works of art. There are tall sugar towers 6 and 8 feet high, in the form of classical temples and obelisks, built up from spun sugar and pulled sugar and hardened sugar paste, decorated with sugar flowers and sugar figurines. The tallest of these, set at intervals along the centre of the table where the canal allows, is a sugar replica of the Carlton House colonnade itself, a confection that has taken the confectioner 3 full days to construct, with each individual sugar pillar shaped by hand and the entablature above piped on in fine sugar paste. It is, in its way, a piece of edible architecture, and the cleverness of including it on this table on this evening is not lost on the guests who can see it from where they sit. There are jellies coloured, layered, moulded into elaborate shapes that wobble on their gold platters as the footmen carry them to the table. The jellies are in deep ruby red from elderberry, in pale gold from lemon, in cool green from peppermint, in pink from rosewater. Some of them are layered in alternating colours, the colours showing through the trembling translucent bodies as the jellies move. There are creams, custards, fools, syllabubs, in individual servings. Each guest has his or her own porcelain ramekin, with the spoon set beside it on the gold plate. The syllabubs are the great seasonal pleasure of the age, made from heavy cream whipped with white wine and sugar and lemon, served chilled, with a dusting of nutmeg on the top. There are fruits, pineapples grown in the royal hothouses, peaches, apricots, grapes, the early summer raspberries and strawberries from the kitchen gardens. The pineapples are the great seasonal status object of the supper. They have been grown with considerable expense and care in the heated houses at Hampton Court and at Frogmore. They are perfectly ripe. They have been peeled, sliced, and arranged in fan patterns on silver plates, with the green crowns of the fruit standing up in the centre of each plate as decoration. A single pineapple, in 1811, is one of the most expensive single fruits available in England. There are perhaps 30 of them on the table tonight, divided into slices and shared out among the guests. The taste, when you put a piece of the cool yellow flesh on your tongue, is the deep, clean, tropical sweetness that pineapples produce when they have been grown to perfect ripeness in proper heat. There are ices flavoured with lemon and orange and rose water and pistachio packed in moulds and brought to the table in silver dishes resting on beds of cracked ice. The ices have been made in the kitchen ice house, where the confectioner has been working for hours with the specialised equipment that the period used for ice making. The metal pewter pails set inside larger wooden tubs of salted ice, the pewter spoon for stirring, the process of agitating the cream until it freezes into the smooth, pale-coloured product. The ices are extraordinarily cold in the air of the conservatory. The first taste of a lemon ice on a silver spoon in the heat of the supper is an acute sensory shock. The sudden cold, the sharp, clean lemon taste, the pain in the teeth that very cold sweet things always produce. Several of the guests around us, encountering the ices for the first time, exclaim involuntarily. The whole sequence of services takes hours. It is a pace that the modern reader sometimes finds hard to imagine. The supper begins around 2:30 in the morning. It will continue with successive services and the pauses between them for conversation and for music, until perhaps 4 or 5 o'clock. The guests will sit at the table for 2.5 or 3 hours. They will eat in moderate quantities, most of them, in the way of any formal supper in any era, will sample a portion of each dish rather than working through everything, but they will sit and look and converse and be served. Through the entire supper, the canal continues to flow. The fountain bubbles at the head of the table behind the prince. The fish, in the early stages of the supper, swim back and forth through the silver-lined channel, weaving between the moss banks. The scented oils in the basin at the far end give off their delicate perfume. The crystal lamps in the vault overhead cast their cool light through the table. Listen, while we sit here, to the sound of the room. There are 400 people seated at this single table. The conversation, in any one moment, is the low hum of perhaps 200 individual conversations going on simultaneously up and down the table. It is not loud. The acoustic of the high-vaulted conservatory, with the ribbed ceiling and the cushioning effect of the plants, absorbs the sound and produces a pleasing low background register. On top of the conversation, the sounds of the supper, the scrape of a knife on a gold plate, the clink of a crystal glass being set down, the pour of wine being added to a glass by a footman behind one of the chairs. From the head of the table, the very faint sound of the fountain, which has been bubbling steadily since before we arrived. From the room beyond, where the second supper is going on for the guests in the tents on the lawn, the louder murmur of the larger crowd, separated from us by the open doors at the far end of the dining room. From much further away, in another part of the house, one of the smaller bands is still playing, the sound carrying very faintly through the open doors of the conservatory. The smell of the room, by the late stages of the supper, is the dense composite smell of a long meal in a hot interior. The food, the wines, the perfumes of the guests, the scented oils from the canal at the far end, the plants in their pots along the walls, all of it has settled into the air of the room and is hanging there, in a kind of olfactory cloud that does not entirely dissipate. By the third service, when the heaviest red wines have been pouring for an hour, the smell of the wine itself is one of the dominant notes, the deep complex fruit and leather smell of large quantities of claret in glasses up and down the table. Mixed in with it, the sweet floral note of the gardenias and jasmines in the pots between the columns. Mixed in with that, the honey note of the candles in the candelabra and the chemical note of the scented oil in the lamps overhead. The temperature in the room has been rising steadily through the supper. The body heat of 400 people in evening dress, plus the heat of the candles and the lamps, plus the residual warmth of the building from the day's sun, plus the steam from the hot dishes that have been arriving and departing for 2 hours, has pushed the air temperature in the conservatory to a level considerably above what is comfortable. The guests, in the elaborate clothes from the period, are visibly suffering. The men's cravats are wilting. The women's gowns are clinging to their backs. The fans are in continuous motion. The footmen behind the chairs are mopping at their faces with handkerchiefs whenever they think no one is looking. The prince himself, at the head of the table in his heavy field marshal's uniform, is visibly perspiring, although he proceeds with the dignity of a man who has been preparing for this evening for 30 years and who is not going to be undone by mere physical discomfort. There is, however, a problem with the fish. As the evening progresses, and the heat in the conservatory rises further, and the water in the canal warms in the air of the room, the fish begin to suffer. Goldfish, like all fish, require oxygenated water at an appropriate temperature to survive. The water in the canal, although flowing, is exposed to the heat of the room and to the warmth of the bodies seated immediately around it. By the middle of the supper, the water has warmed to a temperature that the fish cannot tolerate. The fish, one by one, begin to fail. There are accounts of guests at the table noticing, with various degrees of distress, that fish in the canal directly in front of them are turning belly up and ceasing to move. By the end of the supper, several of the fish are dead. The contemporary report of this, that the fish, at the height of their honours and glory, the greatest any of their kind had ever attained before, they were seen with astonishment and dismay to turn on their backs, the one after the other, and to expire became one of the most quoted passages of the entire fête, and one that the satirists belonging to that world would seize on with relish over the following weeks. The prince, at the head of the table, behind the silver fountain, in his field marshal's uniform, with the man in armour standing motionless behind him, and the gold service gleaming on the table before him, and the music coming faintly from the rooms beyond, is at the highest moment of his life as a host. The supper is being served. The guests are being fed. The spectacle is unfolding exactly as he designed it. The fish in the canal are dying. It is, without anyone present quite recognising it as such at the moment, one of the literary moments of British history. The Prince Regent's first great formal supper, his announcement of the new regime, the spectacle that has been planned for months, contains within itself the built-in metaphor of the dying fish in the silver canal at the centre of the table. The next morning, the satirists will already have begun to notice. It is now around 5 o'clock in the morning. The supper has finished. The last of the desserts have been cleared. The wines have been drunk down to the dregs of the bottles. The candles in the candelabra above the table have burned down to stubs. The prince has risen from his chair at the head of the table. The man in armour, who has stood motionless behind him for 2.5 hours, has been quietly relieved by a steward. The conservatory is in the grey-blue early dawn light that is now beginning to come in through the tall pointed windows, less magical than it had been at the height of the supper. The crystal lamps overhead are dim. The fish in the canal are no longer swimming, for reasons we have already discussed. The whole space, which an hour ago was the heart of the great spectacle, is beginning the long process of returning to being an ordinary room. The guests are leaving. The departure of 2,000 people from a single building in carriages that have to be summoned individually from the holding yards where they have been waiting through the evening is a logistical operation as substantial as the arrival. It will take hours. Some of the senior guests have already left, slipping away during the later stages of the supper through the side doors that connect to the private courtyards, where their carriages have been brought up by the household. The bulk of the guests are leaving now, in a trickle, working their way back through the suite of staterooms toward the Grecian Hall and the front entrance. We follow them. The walk back through the rooms is the same walk we did at the start of the evening, but in reverse and at a different pace. The rooms are emptier now. The candles are lower. The crowd has thinned. The musicians in the smaller rooms have stopped playing, packing their instruments into cases for the journey home. The servants are beginning the early stages of clearing, picking up empty glasses from the side tables. gathering up the lost items that the guests have left behind on the chairs and the windowsills. There is, in the rooms we pass through, the dishevelled quality of any great party in the hours after it has peaked. We reach the Grecian hall. The marble pillars, which had glowed warmly in the candlelight at the start of the evening, look cold now in the grey dawn light. The chandelier overhead, with its candles burned almost to nothing, is being prepared for the next stage of the household routine. A few clusters of guests are still standing in the hall, in conversation, in no hurry. Others are being directed by the stewards toward the front doors. We step out under the colonnade. The first thing you notice, after the close air of the interior, is the air outside. London at 5 in the morning, in the middle of June, is the cool, clean, fresh air of the early summer day. The temperature has dropped considerably from the heat of yesterday afternoon. The sky overhead is the pale grey-blue gold of dawn. The stars have faded. A few high clouds are catching the first colour of the sun, which is somewhere just below the eastern horizon. Birds are beginning to sing in the trees of the gardens behind the house. The dawn chorus of London's urban bird life, the blackbirds and the song thrushes and the early rising pigeons. The colonnade itself is quieter now. The military band that played at the start of the evening is gone, packed up and taken home. The yeomen of the guard have been relieved by a smaller honour guard for the closing hours. The gas lamps under the portico are being extinguished, one, by the household lamp tender. The flowers wreathed on the pillars have wilted in the long heat. The whole forecourt has the quality of a stage set being struck. Our carriage is summoned. It comes up. We climb in. The driver shakes the reins. The horses, which have had several hours of standing in the holding yard, are eager to move. The carriage rolls out of the courtyard, out through the gates, onto Pall Mall, and we begin the journey home through a London that is just beginning to wake up. There is something very about leaving a great party at dawn. The contrast between the world inside, which has been all candlelight and music and warmth and crowd, and the world outside, which is cool and clean and almost empty, is one of the genuine sensory experiences of a kind of life that, by the early 1800s, the upper classes of London had perfected. The fashionable hostesses from that era understood the dawn departure. They built their parties around it. The Carlton House Fête, in this respect, follows the established pattern, but at a scale that no previous host has matched. We ride home, in our imagination, through the streets. The carriage rocks gently on its springs. The early light comes in through the windows. We are tired. We are full of food. We are, in the way of any guest at the end of a great evening, both grateful that we have been there and grateful that it is over. Look out of the carriage window as we go. Pall Mall, which had been blocked solid with carriages 8 or 9 hours ago, is now nearly empty. The pavements, which had been crowded with onlookers at the start of the evening, are now nearly empty too. There are a few people about the early milkmaids with their yokes and pails working their way along the rows of houses to deliver the morning milk. The first watercress sellers, with their flat baskets, calling their wares in the cries that the London street vendors used. A boy sweeping the steps of one of the great houses, the sound of the broom on the stone carrying clearly in the still air. The lamps along the pavement have been extinguished by the lamplighter on his early round, and the black wrought-iron posts stand cold and dark above the stones. The smell of the streets in the early morning is different from the smell of the streets last evening. The day's accumulated dust has settled in the cool overnight air. The drains are quieter. The horses of the early carts have not yet raised the leather and sweat smell that they will produce when the day warms. There is the faint, cool note of the river blowing up from the south. There is the smell of fresh bread from the bakeries that have been open since 4 in the morning, baking the morning loaves. There is, very faintly, the smell of coffee from the coffee houses that have just opened their doors for the early business. The whole composite scent is the scent of a great city in the hour before its proper working day begins, with the night just ending and the day not yet underway. We pass a few other carriages on our journey home. Most of them are returning, like us, from the fête. Their occupants are the same general class of people we have spent the evening with, and the carriages have the same weary look that all departing carriages have at this hour. We exchange bows with the occupants of the carriages we pass, in the silent communication that the period preserved for these moments. We are all, in the social currency of the morning after, members of the group who were there. We will, over the next several days, see each other in various drawing rooms and dining rooms across London, and we will exchange the comments and the reminiscences of the evening that we have just shared. I want to take you, while we are riding home briefly through what happened in the days and weeks that followed the fête, because the immediate aftermath of the evening is one of the things that fixed it, in the imagination of its time, as the iconic event it became. The morning after the fête, the Prince Regent made an unusual decision. He decided that the rooms and the gardens of Carlton House, with all their decorations still in place, should be open to the public for the next 3 days, so that those who had not been invited could nevertheless come and see the spectacle. The decision was, in its way, characteristic. The prince was proud of what he had built. He wanted it seen. He wanted, in particular, the broader public to see the visual evidence of the new regime he was inaugurating. The opening was announced in the newspapers. The household made the necessary arrangements. By the afternoon following the fête, the gates of Carlton House were open, and ordinary Londoners, those who could present themselves at the gate in respectable dress, and who could persuade the gatekeepers to admit them, were allowed inside. For the first 2 days, the opening proceeded reasonably well. Several thousand people came each day. They walked through the suite of staterooms. They saw the conservatory and the supper table, although the canal had been drained and the fish removed by then. They walked the gardens and looked at the tents, which were still standing. They went home impressed. The newspapers reported the opening with enthusiasm. The 3rd day was something else. By the morning of the 3rd day, word had spread across London that this was the last opportunity to see the rooms before they were closed and the decorations removed. The crowd that gathered at the gates of Carlton House on the morning of the 3rd day was, by every contemporary estimate, in the order of 30,000 people. Pall Mall was completely impassable. St. James's Street was blocked. The Haymarket was full. The crowd, pressing toward the gates, became, over the course of the morning, a genuine danger to itself and to the property. The Duke of Clarence, the Prince Regent's naval brother, the future William IV, climbed onto the garden wall of Carlton House in an attempt to direct the crowd and prevent the worst of the crush. The attempt was not entirely successful. The crowd, once it began to move toward the open gates, became something close to a stampede. People were trampled. Several were seriously injured. Many lost shoes, hats, bonnets, gloves, and other items of clothing in the press. Some of the women in the crowd, in the worst stretches of the crush near the gates, had their gowns torn from their bodies. The dignified opening that the prince had imagined turned, on the 3rd day, into a civic disaster. The newspapers reported all of it. The list of injuries was tabulated. The lost property was inventoried. The household, in a dry response to the chaos, placed a large tub outside the gates of Carlton House for the recovery of lost shoes. There were, by the late morning of the fourth day, hundreds of single shoes in the tub, waiting for their owners to come and claim them. Most of them were never claimed. The shoes ended up, eventually, in the household refuse, with only the notation in the steward's records of the Carlton House Fête shoe tub of June 1811 surviving as a kind of comic footnote to the great event. The image of the shoe tub did not, in retrospect, help the Prince Regent's reputation. The satirical and political reaction to the fête in the weeks that followed was substantial. The political class of the country, on both sides of the parliamentary divide, took notice. The Whigs, who had attended in force and who had been hoping for political appointments under the new Regency, were already privately disappointed. The Prince Regent had given them no firm commitments at the fête itself, and over the next year he would, in the event, retain the Tory government of Spencer Perceval, rather than appoint the Whig administration his old friends had hoped for. The fête, in this sense, was a moment of political theatre that had not been followed by any substantial political change. Several of the senior Whigs began, after the fête, to reassess their long-standing assumption that the Prince was their man. The Radical and Republican press, meanwhile, took a harder line. The country was at war. The country was in heavy economic distress. The lower classes were suffering in ways that the more privileged guests at the fête could not entirely ignore. The contrast between the spectacle inside Carlton House and those conditions in the manufacturing towns of the north, between the gold service on the table and the bread shortages in the working-class districts of London, became a theme in the radical newspapers and pamphlets that flourished in the period. One of the most notable of these critical responses came from Leigh Hunt, the editor of a radical newspaper called The Examiner. Hunt wrote a number of pieces critical of the Regent in the months following the fête. In March of the following year, 1812, he published an article so aggressively critical of the Prince Regent's character and conduct that he was prosecuted for criminal libel, convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. The prosecution and conviction of Leigh Hunt for criticism of the Prince became in its turn a kind of political event, contributing to the growing body of literary and journalistic resistance to the Regency that would gather strength over the next decade. Charles Lamb, the essayist who is now best remembered for his children's adaptations of Shakespeare, wrote a mocking poem about the fête shortly after the event, focusing in on the dying fish. The poem circulated widely in literary circles. Lamb was a Republican by temperament, and the private mockery of the fish was, for him, a way of making a larger point about the spectacle. The wider satirical press, the cartoonists like James Gilray, who had been savaging the Prince Regent for years, and Thomas Rowlandson, and the various smaller satirists who worked in the print shops of Fleet Street, produced a stream of caricatures in the months after the fête. Many of them focused on the dying fish, which became a kind of shorthand for the whole event. There were prints of the prince at the head of the table with the fish belly up around him. There were prints of the silver fountain transformed into something more ridiculous. There were prints comparing the fate to the conditions of ordinary Londoners. The visual record of the fête in popular caricature is mostly a hostile one. The print shops of London, in the weeks following the fête, did considerable business in the new caricatures. The shops were premises, mostly along the Strand and around Fleet Street, where the prints were displayed in the windows for passers-by to inspect. A new caricature, posted in the window of a popular print shop, would draw a crowd of people on the pavement, peering in at the latest satirical commentary on the events of the day. The Prince Regent, walking the streets of London in his closed carriage in the weeks after the fête, could not help but notice the clusters of people gathered at the print shop windows, and could not help but suspect, accurately, that the prints they were looking at were satirizing him personally. He had grown used to it over the years. It still rankled. The defenders of the prince, in their turn, made the case for the feat. The official accounts in the more loyal newspapers spoke of an assemblage of beauty, splendour, and profuse magnificence. Thomas More's diary entry, "worthy of a prince," was widely quoted. The supper service was described as the most superb ever exhibited in this country. There was, in the conservative press, a genuine appreciation for the scale of the achievement and for the artistic ambition of the planning. The fête was not without admirers, even after the satirists had finished with it. But the dominant note in the public memory of the event over the following decades was not the admiration, it was the satire. The dying fish in the Silver Canal, the 30,000 people in the crush, the shoe tub at the gates, the single phrase that, more than any other, captured the public imagination was a phrase from one of the satirical pieces then asking what one should think of the bubbling brooks and mossy banks at Carlton House, while ordinary people in the country were unable to find work. The phrase carried, in its contemptuous specificity, the exact tone that the satirical press wanted to fix in the public mind. The fête, which the prince had intended as the inaugural spectacle of his regency, became instead, for many people, the inaugural symbol of its excess. The deeper reason for the savagery of the satirical response, however, was not simply the cost of the feat or the absurdity of the dying fish. It was the contrast between the world inside Carlton House on the night of the 19th of June and the world outside it. The country was at war. British soldiers were dying in Spain. British sailors were dying in the Mediterranean. The economy was suffering. The Luddite riots in the manufacturing towns of the north would begin within a few months of the fête, with hand-loom weavers smashing the new mechanical looms that were destroying their livelihoods. The poor harvests of the next several years would push the price of bread to levels that ordinary people could barely afford. The war with Napoleon would continue for another 4 years, before the final victory at Waterloo in 1815. Through all of this, the Prince Regent's spending on Carlton House, on the Royal Pavilion at Brighton, on the grand service, on the elaborate entertainments, would continue at the level he had established at the fête. The cumulative bill, by the end of his life, would be staggering. The country, in the end, would pay it. The Prince Regent himself was untroubled by any of this. He continued, through the rest of his regency and his subsequent 10-year reign as George IV, to host elaborate entertainments at Carlton House. He continued to spend money on architecture and the arts. He commissioned John Nash to make further improvements to Carlton House, which proved expensive enough that Nash eventually advised that the building be demolished and the funds redirected toward the rebuilding of Buckingham House, the future Buckingham Palace, as a more suitable royal residence. The prince accepted this advice. Carlton House was scheduled for demolition in the mid-1820s. The prince was by then King George IV, having succeeded his father in 1820. Carlton House was demolished in 1826, 15 years after the fête. The columns of the great Corinthian colonnade, the columns under which we walked at the start of the evening, were preserved, however. They were transferred by the architect's arrangement to a new building that was being constructed at the same time on the north side of Trafalgar Square. The columns now form the front of the National Gallery, where they can still be seen by the modern visitor to London. The portico of Carlton House, in this architectural translation, has survived the building it was built to serve. The rest of Carlton House, the Grecian hall with the marble pillars, the crimson drawing room with the silk damask, the throne room, the circular dining room, the music room, the Gothic conservatory with the soaring ribbed vault and the crystal lamps. None of these survived. They have not existed for 200 years. The site of Carlton House itself is now the open square between the foot of Regent Street and the York Column, an open space at the south end of Waterloo Place, with a column visible from Pall Mall and the ground beneath it, landscaped as a public terrace. The 2,000 guests who walked through Holland's interiors on the evening of the 19th of June 1811 walked through rooms that, 15 years later, ceased to exist. The grand service of gold and silver gilt plate, however, it was added to over the rest of the Prince Regent's life. It became, after his accession as George IV, part of the formal regalia of the British monarchy. It is still used today on state occasions at Buckingham Palace, 2 centuries after Paul Storr first delivered the bulk of the pieces to Carlton House. The plates and the candelabra and the wine coolers and the silver gilt elements that gleamed on the 200-foot table on the night of the fête are, many of them, the same physical objects that grace the state banquets of the present-day monarchy. The continuity of the silver, in this respect, is the longest single material continuity of the entire fête. The silver fountain and the silver-lined canal, however, did not survive. They were dismantled after the fête, melted down, and returned to the silver stocks of Rundell Bridge and Rundell, where they were eventually reworked into other commissions. The fish were buried in the gardens of Carlton House. The conservatory was eventually demolished with the rest of the building. The man in armour was returned to the historical collection from which he had been borrowed, where the suit of armour itself remains, somewhere in one of the great national museums, still being shown to visitors who do not know that the empty steel housing once stood, on a single evening in 1811, behind the chair of the Prince Regent at the head of the longest supper table in British history. The Bourbon court in exile, who had been the official ostensible reason for the fête, eventually went home. Napoleon was defeated in 1815 at Waterloo. The Bourbons were restored to the throne of France. The Comte de Lille became Louis XVIII. He reigned for 9 years before his death in 1824. He never returned to Carlton House after the fête, but the personal connection between the two royal families, marked at the feet by their shared evening, persisted in the ceremonial visits and exchanges of the later Regency and the reign of George IV. I want to come back, before we close the evening, to something I mentioned at the very beginning, the absence of the Queen. While the fête was unfolding in central London, the Queen was at Windsor, in the set of apartments she kept for herself in the castle, attending to her husband. The King, who was deep in his final illness, was being kept in a separate suite of rooms in the castle, with his doctors and his attendants. The Queen was 67 years old. She had been married for nearly 50 years. She had borne 15 children. She was responsible, in any practical sense, for the continued life of the king during this final long illness, and she was performing the responsibility with the patient steadiness that had characterized her whole adult life, while her son was in his field marshal's uniform at the head of the 200-foot table in central London, with the silver fountain bubbling behind him and the live fish swimming in the silver-lined canal in front of him. His mother was sitting in a drawing room at Windsor, reading by the light of a single oil lamp, with one of her ladies beside her, while her husband slept fitfully in the next room. Her unmarried daughters and her granddaughter Princess Charlotte were in the castle with her. Princess Charlotte, 15 years old and bitterly resentful at having been excluded from the fête, was somewhere in the castle's smaller rooms, probably in tears or trying not to be. The contrast between the two evenings, separated by 20 miles of countryside and an immense gulf of temperament, is one of the things I find most quietly characteristic of the British royal family in the early 1800s. The mother at Windsor, who had been the patient centre of the family for 50 years, and who wanted nothing more than the life of a wife and mother who happened, by accident of marriage, to be a queen. The son in central London, who had built the most expensive private spectacle in the history of the monarchy, and who was at this moment at the highest point of his life as a host, both of them in their different ways, doing what their characters made it inevitable they would do. The Queen would die in 1818, 7 years from tonight, at Kew, where she had spent every summer of her marriage. The King would die in 1822 years after the Queen, at Windsor, in the suite of rooms in which he was tonight asleep. The Prince Regent would succeed his father as George IV, and reign for 10 more years before his own death in 1830. The whole family configuration that existed on the night of the 19th of June, 1811, the parents at Windsor, the son in London, would be, within 20 years, completely gone. The Regency itself, however, would last only 9 more years after tonight, until the King's death in 1820. In those 9 years, the Regency would become one of the most distinctive cultural periods of English history. The architecture, the literature, the fashion, the manners, the food, the social rituals, all of these would be shaped in part by the visible example of the new regent and his court. The royal pavilion at Brighton would be completed. The remodelling of central London by John Nash would proceed. The novels of Jane Austen, which were being written in the years immediately around the fête, would document the same society in a different register. The poetry of Byron and Shelley and Keats would emerge. The whole flowering of what we now call the Regency period would unfold over the next decade and a half. The fête, in retrospect, marks the formal beginning of all of this. The night of the 19th of June, 1811, was the night on which the Prince Regent inaugurated, with a single immense party, the era that would eventually carry his title. He was, by every measure we have, a flawed and difficult man. He was also, by every measure we have, a serious patron of the visual culture of his time. The era that began on this night was, for all its excesses and its self-indulgences, one of the most artistically productive periods in British cultural history. I want, before we close, to put one more thought into the air, and that thought is about the way history remembers people. The Prince Regent, on the night of the fête, is at the height of his powers. He is the host of the largest private gathering in the country's history. He is the new ruler in all but name. He is, for one evening, the centre of the political and social universe of Britain. 200 years from tonight, however, he will not be primarily remembered for the fête. He will be remembered, if at all, for 2 things. For the royal pavilion at Brighton, which he built in his middle years, and for the phrase Regency that the period of his rule contributed to the English language. Of the great spectacle of tonight, in 2 centuries, almost nothing will remain in popular memory except the comic detail of the dying fish, which will continue to be quoted in popular histories as a symbol of imperial excess, and his mother, the Queen at Windsor, who refused to come tonight. She will be remembered, if at all, by people who walk the gardens at Kew and who notice, in some corner of the wood, the thatched cottage with the painted bamboo walls. She did not throw the great party. She did not commission the gold service. She did not have the silver fountain built. She walked the gardens. She raised her children. She read her devotional poetry by the lamp in the drawing room, while her son was at the head of the longest supper table in British history. But there is something, I think, about the contrast between those two kinds of memory that this evening at Carlton House illuminates better than almost any other event of the age. The loud and the quiet, the seen and the unseen, the historical and the domestic, both of them, in their different ways, real. Both of them, 2 centuries on, capable of being walked through, in our imagination, on a long evening in a comfortable place, by a listener who has the patience to follow the details slowly to the end. And so, as the evening at Carlton House ends, I want to bring you back, slowly, to where you actually are. We have been, in our imagination, in the summer of 1811, riding home through the dawn of London after 8 or 9 hours inside one of the most lavish parties ever held in this country. We have walked through the rooms of a building that no longer exists. We have stood in the conservatory under the soaring Gothic vault. We have sat at the long table with the silver fountain and the silver canal and the live fish. We have watched the prince in his field marshal's uniform at the head of the table, with the man in armour silent behind him. We have heard the bands and the conversation and the music. We have smelled the candles and the food and the perfumes and the fireworks. We have been to the party of the century. We have, more than that, been to an evening on which a man inaugurated an era of British history, and in which the contradictions and absurdities and extravagances of that man and that era were laid out by his own design for the entire political and social leadership of the country to witness. For the carriage we are riding in the world we are imagining, has reached the corner of the street where we live. The horses are slowing. The driver is preparing to set us down. The dawn light is now full, and the early shapes of working London, the milk carts, the bread carts, the early apprentices opening up the shops, are beginning to move through the streets. The sun is just rising over the eastern roofs. The hour, in the world that you and I actually inhabit, is also late, perhaps, or early. It has been a long evening. You have been listening for some time. The room around you, wherever you are, has its own details that this story cannot know about. Your own light, your own blanket, your own quiet. I hope that the picture of the fête, of the prince at the head of the table, of the long supper and the silver canal, and the dying fish and the field marshal's uniform, and the long return through the streets at dawn, has been a comforting one to spend a few hours with. There are more stories like this one, more evenings, more moments in which a person, in a place, on a night, did something that the rest of us, 2 centuries later, can still walk through if we slow ourselves down enough to do it. The carriage has stopped. The driver is climbing down to open the door. The matting in the courtyard of Carlton House has been rolled up by the household staff and stored away. The crystal lamps in the conservatory have been extinguished. The man in armour has been returned to his collection. The fish have been buried. The Prince Regent has gone upstairs to his private apartments to sleep. The Queen at Windsor is sitting in her drawing room, reading. The King in his locked rooms is asleep. The whole vast machine of the night has wound down, and the ordinary working day of London is beginning, and somewhere, in 1,000 places over the country, the news of what happened at Carlton House last night is just beginning to be told. For now, sleep well. Good night.